I think we explained it.
Thank you. Welcome to our, I think this is our fourth meeting, either fourth or fifth meeting. And we've got a couple more, but hopefully we'll be at the decision-making point shortly. Why don't we introduce ourselves for the record, and we'll start with Tad over there.
Yes, sir. I'm Tad Delegate. Greg Anderson was saying that this must be our 30th meeting.
No, he's not saying that.
He said that
It's our 30th meeting in
This
in
may
and
be
out
my
of the
30th
sunshine.
meeting, but not the committees. So that's a great way to start, by the way. Greg Anderson, at-large Group 4. Thank you.
Kirsten Doolittle.
Gwen Yates.
John Wilbank. David Moore.
Bill Shy.
Kelly O'Leary.
Bob Miller.
John Thompson.
Carl Cannon. Bill Rupp.
Sherry McGill.
Great, thank you very much. Y'all will have gotten emailed yesterday a revised governance, I'll call them recommendations. I'll go over those very briefly in a minute to show the red lines. You also got this morning, and it's passed out because you wouldn't have gotten it by your emails, a proposal from Tad Delegate for a new number 10 in the governance, which when we get to toward the end of the meeting, I'm just going to ask him to comment on. It's not my intention that we decide all this today. We need to reflect, and we need to hear. Mr. Keene's going to talk to us today too. You also got from the JPF-PF their written comments, I'll put it, on the governance part of our work, which we'll discuss, and hopefully Mr. Keene will have some things to say about that. Just very quickly, the red line of the governance document is here. And just to point out, I tried to pick up everything that y'all had talked about at the meeting. There was pretty good consensus on the document as a whole. But in paragraph 1, you'll see it's expanded to include the 5-county area. In the bottom of paragraph 1, we changed it to 2 people serving 2 years and 3 years for their initial terms. When Charlie Appleby had suggested that one served 4 years, well, that was longer than the term, so it didn't seem to me you could do that. Then we added some ethical responsibilities. I think that David Bohr had suggested about spousal and siblings relationships with members of the committee. That's also what subparagraph D does. Paragraph 3 on the Office of General Counsel just picks up some minor editing on the term limits for the board members. That changes it to 2 4-year terms rather than 3. Paragraph 6 makes the 90 days, which would be December 31st, consistent there. And on the next page, it also picks up suggestions from David Drain about consolidating some of these reports, as y'all remember our discussion. Over in paragraph 7, that's just a editorial. Number 9 is essentially the same, except some cleanup from David Drain, and changes it to semi-annual rather than quarterly. And then David also, you'll recall our discussion that we didn't. It was impractical to reconsider the UAAL each quarter, that was really an annual determination. So that's essentially what that does. We'll come back in a little bit and discuss it if we have time, but that gets it out before y'all. So we're very glad to have John Keene with us. John, if you'd make your way up to the podium, and while you do that, I'll introduce the mayor is here. Welcome, Mayor. We're glad you're here. And Council President Gulliford is here. Welcome to you. And I don't see Chairman, is Bobby Deal here? I don't see him.
Mike Brown.
Okay. Yes, Kirsten.
Did you mention that Tad had provided a proposal for paragraph 10?
Yes. That's on your, it should be on your handouts.
Can I just explain that real quick?
Yeah, we'll do that in a minute. We'll do that after Mr. Keene. I wanted to, Mr. Keene, we didn't get to last, and I really wanted him to be able to go forward first and spend as much time as you need. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the commission. And once again, on behalf of the board and our members, we appreciate your commitment of your time and talent to try and solve this issue that's facing the city. We have some recommended changes to the document that the chairman handed out, and I believe everybody has a copy of our recommended changes. These have not been presented to the pension board, and they are subject to the pension board's final approval, but if you would like, I can whiz through them right quick.
That would be helpful if your rationale. Yeah.
Correct.
That's this right here.
It's the one with large type on the top for those that are visually challenged.
And I might point out that I don't think this related to the final draft, because this, for example, refers to Duval County, but we didn't expand that.
Right. Okay. On the Investment Advisory Committee that you originally talked about incorporating in the charter, we believe it would be much easier to place that in the ordinance code. The state law provides that the trustees will be the final authority on issues dealing with the Police and Fire Pension Fund, and we have modified to some extent the provisions you were recommending for the Investment Advisory Committee. We made them fiduciaries, expanded their living arrangements so they can be living into the greater Jacksonville metropolitan statistical area that someone on this side suggested at the last meeting. Provides that the members of the Investment Advisory Committee have 2-year terms, I believe is what you suggested, so that was all right with us. They're going to be required to file the Form 1 with the Supervisor of Elections. The original proposal that you submitted talked about them reviewing the responses to the RFP. Last time we did one, we had 139 responses. You're talking about 3 weeks of work, sitting there all day long reading through them. So we have kind of changed it that the staff and our professional folks out at Summit initially review the RFPs and come up with a list and then discuss it with the advisory committee and forward those recommendations on to the board. As I said, the committee members, because they will be making recommendations to the Board of Trustees, shall be considered fiduciaries to the fund. On the use of the general counsel, Bob Klausner will be here in just a few moments, so I'm going to skip over number 2 and let him talk about that. That's your number 2. That's our number 2 in our proposal.
So let me just,
our response.
Just to make it clear that the number 2 in the memo y'all will find on the ethics.
Ethics.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we're for ethics.
Okay. Okay.
Term limits for the board members. State law provides that the 2 city council appointees serve a term but can be replaced by the council whenever they want to. That does not apply to the 5th trustee or to the 2 trustees elected by the members. There is no provision in the statute that creates those to provide a term limit for our employee members or the 5th trustee. Moving on to the actuarial standards, our board has already adopted a policy of annual actuarial evaluations of the fund. The selection of the next administrator. I'm under contract to the board till December 31st, 2017. I've informed the board I will not seek, nor will I accept an extension of my employment contract. I'm going to go home. You had proposed that we mandatorily hire some nationwide search firm. That's an expensive proposition. We recommended that we utilize the services of the city Human Resource Division that has done a very good job of selecting a large number of people who are serving the citizens of Jacksonville. But also, if that doesn't work, that we could seek a nationwide search. As for the, we've changed the requirements or added a few things and fixed some of them. You should note that in your original proposal for the next administrator, neither Bill Gates nor Steve Jobs would have been eligible to apply. So we've made some little changes here which stay in the spirit of what you were talking about, but make a few little tweaks here and there. There's been a lot of discussion about the senior staff voluntary pension plan, and we will, if everything else falls together, recommend to the board that the plan close on the last payday of September, and that the board purchase annuities to cover the future benefit payments. The status of the 30-year agreement, we are certainly willing to discuss with the board a shortening of it. Kind of like the idea of the 80% plus funding threshold. The former chief financial officer of the city, rather, they liked 90%, but 80% is a nationwide accepted threshold of a well-funded pension plan. And we would also stress that the consultation among the parties is already embodied in Article 2207 of the Charter. I recently met with Mayor Brown, and we're in the process of scheduling some quarterly fireside chats to talk about things. We would hope that when all this comes together, that into the one ordinance that's going to go before the City Council, that we would pick up the long-sought amendments to our investment authority at the same time, as well as create a chapter fund account using 175 and 185 monies for our active members. And that's about the extent of our comments on the document that you had presented. Again, we note that a great deal of time has been spent on this by the members of the committee, and it's for the well-being of our city. Those of us that have lived here for an awful long time look forward to better days off in the future. And now to go back onto another subject that was brought up at the last meeting. First of all, do you have any questions you want to say about that, or just going to absorb that for a minute?
Now, questions of Mr. Keene on their comments, and I want others to ask the question. Let me just ask, it'd be my hope that we could get together and wordsmith this document to the extent we can agree, so that we then can come back for the committee to hear at least where we're in agreement, then they would decide because having this now, but if we can get it all into one document and then note where we agree and disagree, then we have a way.
Another good plan.
Okay, great. So with that, questions of Mr. Keene on anything related to his comments so far?
You're saying state statute prohibits use of term limits for this fund?
For the two trustees that are elected by the members, as well as for the fifth member, yes, sir. But the statute permits the city appointees, although have an established term, statute says they can be removed at any time by the city council.
Charter says that too. I'd ask Jim Lynn, because see, what we're doing here is changing the statute, because if we amend the charter, then that's a statute. So, and Jim, would you like to comment on that at all? Not to have an argument here, but just to put that before the committee so we know the thinking, as far as what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think what you've said is correct. I mean, if it's the task force recommendation to change the terms of the board members, I think that can be done by a charter amendment or by legislation, state legislation. The general law in 175 and 185 on the terms of the members wouldn't prohibit that because of the plan's deemed to comply status.
Thank you. And I know Mr. Klausner, who is coming, that he and Jim may have a different view of the law on that, and we'll just have to pick that when we go. And hopefully we'll be able to resolve that so we won't get into litigation. Other questions of Mr. Keene?
Just clarifying, so we're going to get down to one document, and then where there's disagreement, we'll be able to see that.
Hopefully so. That's the idea. And then y'all will need to, if we have time today, any further discussion that y'all have, realizing that it's not final, anything about the governance proposals, then we take that into account. Okay, John. Greg?
Thanks, Chairman. Good afternoon, John.
Mr. Chairman?
Two quick questions. Your comment about the investment, the RFP, so you're just saying it'll be problematic if you wanted to look at a new fund. You would generally do an RFP for that, so you would typically use your consultant at the time to run that RFP. And would the consultant make the final decision, or would it be, how would that go from that point?
When the board directs us to seek a investment professional to aid in our investments, we publish 2 ads in nationwide publication, Pension and Investments. We then give them generally 3 to 4 weeks to respond to the RFP. The basic RFP contains about 50 pages that they have to fill out. When we receive those responses, we ship one copy out to Summit Strategies, who is the investment consultant to the board, and they review each one of the responses in accordance to the matrix that's contained in the purchasing code. We do the same thing here in our office. When the appropriate time passes, usually about 6 weeks for them to finish their work on their end and or our end. We have Summit come to Jacksonville, and we sit down and we talk about, we talk about the top 10. Generally, the top 10 are close. Our number 3 could be their 5 or vice versa, or our number 10 could be 11 or 12. They're not far off when you follow the scoring, but it takes an enormous amount of time to read each one of these and score them on those 10 points, and to expect volunteer members to come down and spend maybe 3 weeks, as fast as you can read them and comprehend them and come to a logical scoring process, that's a lot of work.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that.
So our proposal was that we do the initial work and then bring the committee in to look at it.
And in your mind, who would make the final decision?
The Board of Trustees.
All right. You had mentioned that you're planning on retiring, would you explain to me the way right now your successor would be chosen, and if there are any changes that are contemplated here on how that would change?
If I was to leave today, the board could pick who they desired. We have a process of selecting people. We talked to our business partner at the City Human Resources. We've advertised a deputy director's position, and we also advertised it on the State Government Finance Officers Association website. And that was not a very successful endeavor using the state website. We didn't receive any responses. But as a general rule, the board would advertise the position much similar to the RFPs, and then go through them and pick someone.
So it's the board's decision?
Board's decision.
And you're not recommending any changes to that?
No, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I take a statutory change to do that.
Right. Thank you.
John, let me just to be clear, in the recommended paragraph on the Investment Advisory Committee, there was a bifurcated responsibility, one on general matters of advice that work just like a committee and make recommendations to the board. And ultimately, it's the board that has the ultimate fiduciary responsibility.
Correct.
But on selection of investment managers, even if you use the staff-driven initial cuts, that the Financial Investment Advisory Committee would sign off on it. And if they voted no on a particular manager, that would not go to the board further. But if they voted yes, it would then go to the board. Would you have any objection with that?
Yes, sir. When the final decision-making is invested with you, we can't have these people over here saying you can't even make the decision. I know your original approach was if the advisory committee said no, the company could not move further into the process. That's not in concordance with the law.
Okay, I just
we
want
believe.
to get your position on that. Okay, good.
But we do think the advisory committee could serve an important role.
Yeah. And it would have a public purpose too.
Sure.
Good. John?
Thank you. First of all, Mr. King, these are spot-on recommendations. I was curious as it relates to real estate investments which have been held in the fund and have been proposed for the fund. I'm not sure I understand how that process works. If somebody is engaged in that consulting, if they go through the RFP for that, how does that work to assure that any real estate discussions in the future would also have the same effective process?
We have two investment managers that handle our real estate. One is J.P. Morgan in New York, and the other is Principal. And they were hired the same way as our equity managers and our fixed income managers are hired. Same RFP process.
Okay. Other questions of Mr. King?
Just sort of a process. I'm going back to the Investment Advisory Committee. If the Board of Trustees disagrees with the recommendations made by that committee, then there would be a report or something that was a part of the minutes to show that the board had at least looked at it and discussed it and chosen not to follow what we hope are experts.
In the original proposal you are speaking of, and our substitute proposal was the advisory committee meets, they go over, they come down, they recommended 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, top 6, for example, and send them on to the board. And the board's going to hire somebody out of that top 6.
Okay.
So that clarifies it. So out of that
Right.
6, okay.
Or
Okay, that,
8, you know.
Right, but you wouldn't substitute other people.
No, 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 no,
okay,
no, 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 no,
that's
no, no.
clarification.
And somebody who is 51st on the list is not going to be hired in this cycle.
That's helpful. Okay, good. Other questions? And in reality, that's how it'd work anyway, because you're not going to have no's and yeses on managers. You're going to
Right.
have a group. Okay, so that-
But the Investment Advisory Committee would review the responses and determine that, yes, this is a qualified company. They meet the threshold standards in the statute. They've been in business 5 years. There are no problems with the SEC or other oversight agencies. They meet the insurance requirements. They have performed in the percentile rankings for other jurisdictions. We're not going to be involved in hiring wink and blink and nod just because they're a group of local good people who want to become investment managers. They might be good people. They might be good investment managers, but they need to go off somewhere and work for some people for at least 5 years and compile a record and then respond to our next RFP.
Good. Kirsten?
I was curious as to what your general reaction and thought was to the proposal to add an investment advisory committee. I mean, getting out of the weeds just generally, is that something that you see as adding value to your process and your work?
It could add value as well as transparency. It's worked successfully the way we recommend it in Tallahassee. The 3 trustees of the Florida Retirement System, which is the 4th largest public pension plan in our country, are 3 of the busiest people in government. And even though they have cabinet aides to brief them on this part of the agenda, this part of the agenda, da, 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 and they have the State Board of Administration to actually operate the Florida Retirement System. They have an investment advisory committee that comes in and does much of the work here, and part of the words that are on y'all's page as well as our page are words we supplied to the chairman.
I think that means he would be supportive of it.
Absolutely.
Right? Greg?
My final question, and I just want to be clear on your position. So let's get another example on the table. Let's say the investment committee would like to change the style of investments, that instead of taking an active investment posture, this committee recommended a passive model, indexed funds. If they made that recommendation, who in your mind makes the ultimate decision on whether to adopt that or not?
The trustees.
Okay, thank you.
And that would then require a change to the asset allocation plan and the investment policy statement. And if the board did that, made that change, that would then call for a new lineup of professional investment advisors, and then this process that we're discussing would kick in.
Thank you.
And to Gwen's earlier question, that would all be public and transparent. So as the trustees were considering that recommendation, they would have the committee's report and the rationale behind that.
Certainly.
Good. Other questions? Carl?
John, you've been in your job for a long time, and you're totally on top of it, and you've read all of the recommendations that we've made.
Yes, sir.
The thing that hangs me up the most is that according to state law, we're supposed to be 100% funded. And we are 39%, I believe. And what I'm trying to get at and get the answer to is, what have we done in our document if we should approve it today, that will change that to where we can go from 39 to 80. Have we nailed that issue to where, have we put things in this document that will address that?
Yes, sir. In the actuarial standards, let me answer your question with just a few brief review of the facts. The actuarial assumptions that served as the guidelines for the Police and Fire Pension Fund were originally established in 1991, and at the city's insistence, they were placed in the settlement agreement as a basic set of assumptions. It had a provision that we could revisit them, recommend changes. We did recommend changes on numerous occasions. And the city's uniform answer was no. The reason they said no was changing those assumptions was going to increase the city's cost. And that's understandable. The actuary, who was serving as the city's reviewing actuary at the time, was also the actuary of the General Employees Pension Plan. And so they had their assumptions over there at 8.4. Ours were 8.5. We wanted to go down to 8.2 and then start a staircase down, and they said no. Because if they agreed with us, it was going to rain on them on the other side of the street for the general employees. The pension system, police and fire, correction, general employees, are all under stress, partly due to the worldwide economic situation, our domestic stock market crash, the real estate, main drivers of it. The goal of Chapter 112 of the statutes is to have the plans fully funded. When the crash happened in 2009, the Florida retirement system lost $34 billion, and they were still 90% plus funded. And the reason for that is in the years going up, they continued to make well-funded decisions, even as it passed 80, as it passed 90, as it passed 100. They continued to make the contributions. On the city side, when members enroll in the drop plan, and generally we have about 20% of the workforce in the drop plan, the city makes a zero contribution. So in the first 8 or 9 years of the drop plan, police officers and firefighters working for the city worked over 6,000 years of combined service. And the city didn't put a penny in because under the ordinance code, they're not required to. They fixed it so when they go into drop, they don't have to pay. Now those 6,000 years translates into hundreds of people with 20 years of service standing outside our door wanting a pension without any money being put up. Not that the city did anything wrong, because they exempted themselves from paying when they went into drop. On the state side, when members enter the drop, a contribution continues to be made. But the basic cause of where we're at today, in addition to the economic situations that we're all familiar with, is not the rapid change in underlying actuarial assumptions, which would have driven up cost. Now, it wasn't just the city actuary that supported not making a change. It was the state actuary also, the people in Tallahassee who have oversight responsibility. We went to the city, we said, we think we ought to change this. They said no. We went to the state and said, you know, if we push this issue, what's your position? They said, you're doing fine. There was a change, those people left. The new people came. They said, we don't like this. We want the actuarial assumption reduced to 7.75, which the board did on October the 1st of 2012 in response to the state's demand. They have subsequently made the same demands on the general employee system to reduce the actuarial assumption. So that's where it all came from. Some of the people were late to the party, but in the long run, it's a situation where we're playing catch up. In 1970, the pension systems, 15% funded, 20% funded, in that range, the entire system, 15 to 20%, under the leadership of late council members Lanahan and Saltzbacher, and with the strong support of former council auditor Bob Johnson. The city embarked on a program of increasing funding to ramp up the strength of the pension funds. At one time, both of them were over 100% funded. And we found out the hard way.
Have we addressed that issue in this document? Or is it just going to continue on?
Let me answer that, because this is just governance so far. And you're going to hear, well, part of what you heard from David had to do with, and John and Bob, had to do with funding the unfunded liability. And then you'll hear some pension design proposals today, and that's what David Drain and Jonathan. So it's all of them, not just what we've done so far.
In your previous comments, Mr. Cannon, you alluded to the fact that you wanted the committee to come forth with a recommendation that was going to require that the funding be made. Then I believe you used the term feet to the fire or something like that. When the final work product comes out, we believe that it will incorporate those type of safety mechanisms for future funding.
And one of those is addressed in paragraph 9 that deals with wherever we agree, we would agree to funding. This is where we got into that lengthy discussion about the 120 million and that 190 million and where that ends up, plus having it monitored by Judge Schlesinger and that. So that's going to be very important.
And in our document, it's on paragraph 4, where we talked about effective October the 1st, 2014, the required city contribution will be not less than the minimum recommended contribution in the most recent actuarial evaluation. Now, to be clear, through this long process, the city has always paid the minimum required contribution. There were some years when the city did not pay out of general revenue on both the police and fire side as well as the general employee side. They used the reserve accounts. Well, if you're putting $100 a month into your 457 account, and in July you get a statement saying you have just received $100 interest on your first 6 months, and you say, well, that's going to be my July payment. I'm going to take that $100 and go do something else. By the time December gets here, you should have had $1,300 and you only had $1,200. And that's much what the city did. They didn't do anything wrong. They didn't do anything that was not permitted. But in looking back, the wisdom of the choices they made may be criticized by some, if not many. Using the reserve funds, reduce the fiscal support that materially weakened the funds when 2008 got here. And that would have been the time when the city wished they had had those reserve accounts. The reserve account for the Police and Fire Pension Fund was established in 1991. And it came as a result of the extensive hurricane damage in South Florida, with the city required to make an annual contribution, and then faced with a calamity of great infrastructure damage. They have to pay us, they have infrastructure damage. That you got to get the streets open, got to get the lights on again. So we devised a program of establishing this reserve account for future situations. The folks in charge at the time decided that almost each year one of the situations was there, and so rather than paying the annual required contribution directly out of general revenue, which would then impact the budget, they went over and at one time took as much as half of the annual required contribution from the reserve account. And it's not unknown to any of the folks that were here at the time. It was contained in the city budget, annual budget, showed what the contribution was. It wasn't a secret.
Other questions? Excuse me.
Just a quick question about your comments about term limits. Florida statute notwithstanding, what's your position on term limits if that weren't a condition in your mind?
I'm for term limits. They're called elections. I believe that in many cases, the clamor from the 90s to have term limits so we could get people out hasn't served every level of government as efficiently as the supporters desired. So I never was...
Just in terms of the Investment Advisory Committee.
The term limits for the Investment Advisory Committee, that was a recommendation that y'all came up with, or the chairman, or the task force. Not trying to blame you, but you're pretty straight in front of me there. Blame you as any.
Right, I'm a big target.
That's right. They're fine with us if that's what they wanted, but we necessarily don't think that they're effective. But let's just talk about it for just a second. Let's say that you're put on this committee, and you know, they're either going to meet monthly or quarterly. Let's say quarterly. So that's 4 times a year. First person's only going to come to 4 meetings, and they're off because of the rotation that was put in there. But generally, I think when you're doing this kind of work on a voluntary basis, and you're willing to devote the time and talent to it, I think it's admirable, and I think term limits should not have an impact on it. However,
That's eight years, as I recall.
but we do know that from a fiscal standpoint, the people from the industry that are going to come and serve on this committee, they're not going to want to make it a career because they're prohibited from doing any work with us. So, you know, there's 2 sides of the coin.
Sure. But fundamentally, I think the question is you wouldn't have an objection to term limits on the committee while you do on the police and fire trustees.
Correct.
Okay. Right. Other questions? Okay, and now continue on with the other parts.
At the last session, a question was raised about fiduciary responsibility. The trustees bear the fiduciary responsibility for the fund. And under the state law, the trustees who serve as a fiduciary have one source that they serve, and that's the trust fund. It makes no difference whether they're one of the 2 city council appointees, one of the 2 employee elected trustees, or whether it's the 5th trustee. All 5 of those trustees owe their duty and trust and responsibility to what is in the best interest of the trust fund and those members, no one else. That's why the trustees are not referred to as the city trustee or the union trustee, unlike in a Taft-Hartley situation, because they are trustees for the entire fund to the members of the fund. And we have plenty of lawyers here to correct me if I didn't say that exactly right. And I feel sure they will, if I didn't.
Anything else? I saw Bob Foster come in, and John has said you want to tell us about the general counsel. He punted on that to you. I don't think the task force has met Bob Foster before. He is counsel to the JPFPF and to the General Employees Fund also.
Well, let me introduce him.
Okay. Yep.
The general counsel for the Police and Fire Pension Fund is Robert D. Klausner, who is standing here behind me. Mr. Klausner was born and raised in Jacksonville and went to the University of Florida. Some of these people are Seminoles. He has a law degree from a Florida school. At any rate, he has served as general counsel for the Police and Fire Pension Fund since 1988. In addition to doing work for us, he works with the general employees, and he'll describe who some of these other folks are. He has testified before Congress. He represents pension funds from Key West to Anchorage, Alaska, from San Diego to New Hampshire. Mr. Klausner, we're going to let you talk about number 2.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and members of the task force. I'd like to thank you for your service. I have the privilege of working with over 100 public pension plans in the country, of all shapes and sizes and in all forms of financial strength or weakness, and have been involved in a lot of the current issues of the day, including the issues going on now in Detroit and in some of the other cities that are struggling financially. And to see citizen involvement, those of you I know who are all busy and have other lives to lead, willing to give your support to help find a path which will ensure that our police officers and firefighters here in Jacksonville will receive the benefits that were promised to them for their loyal service, I think, speaks well for all of you and for the city. I began my career as a lawyer working for the city of Miami. When I graduated from law school, I was hired by the city of Miami to be their first police legal advisor in 1977. And I think the reason I was hired is because there was only one other University of Florida graduate in the office, and he wanted somebody to help him cover the bets on the Miami football games. But after being in the police department for about a year and a half, I was asked if I knew what the pension system was. And being a college graduate, I said, sure, that's what you get when you retire. To which the city attorney then said to me, you're it. I said, what's it? He said, you're our new pension lawyer and you're late for the meeting. And so I borrowed a police car and I went down to the Miami City Hall, which sits in the old Pan American World Airways flying boat station on the shores of Biscayne Bay with waving palm trees and the ocean lapping behind. And I learned when I walked into the pension board meeting that the city had withdrawn $50 million in the pension trust to use to pay for something else. They had issued a bond for something, but had spent that money on something else, and they needed to do what the bond required them to do, so out went the money from the pension fund because they were the keeper of the cash in those days. And the Board of Trustees said, we want you to go and sue the city to get our $50 million back. Sounded reasonable to me. I had a duty to them, and when I went to the city attorney at the time, I was still a pretty young lawyer, and he looked at me like I had two heads. And he said, son, do you know what it says on your paycheck? And I said, well, sir, it's so small, I try not to think about it. But I was making about $2 an hour less than a sanitation worker, and they were done at 9 o'clock in the morning, so I was questioning my career path at the moment. But he said, it says City of Miami. And I said, well, you know, Mr. City Attorney, I said, you've assigned me to be the lawyer to the pension trust, right? And he said, yes. And I said, we have a fiduciary duty to them as their lawyer. And he said, yes. And I said, we have to put their interest ahead of all others. And he said, that's right. And I said, but you're also saying, because I get my paycheck from the city, I have a duty to the city, a fiduciary duty to the city, and I have to put their interest above everybody else. And he said, that's right. And I said, well, what do you do when one person you have an exclusive duty of loyalty to is stealing from another person you have an exclusive duty of loyalty to? And he said, go back to the pension board and talk him out of it. Actually, I left government service shortly thereafter. I actually ended up on the other side of that litigation against the city, and it took 12 years to bring it to an end. And it cost a lot more money than the $50 million that was out there with lost earnings and everything else. And it resulted in a substantial restructuring of the city's pension system so that that could never happen again. And what that lesson taught me is that you have to have someone whose duty of loyalty is solely to your client. And I have a wonderful relationship with your general counsel. She's a fine lawyer, a person of high integrity. We're friends. And we speak on a variety of legal issues. We've been co-counsel on matters together. We've been across the table from each other. But that's business. And I'm honored that she has trusted me to serve as an advisor for the city general employees retirement system. Both the Port Authority and the Airport Authority have used our services. The JTA's used our services, and the JEA and the St. Johns River Power Park use our services, all for benefits, because that's what we do. We represent state and local government retirement systems, and unlike in my days doing labor work where you have a side, with pensions there isn't a side, there's just an answer. And so I think that my own history has led to the reason why Florida in 1986, when it amended the pension law, chapters 175 and 185, actually reversed what was then existing jurisprudence and Attorney General's opinions and said, pension boards have to be able to pick their own lawyers. And it said, but it did contemplate that cities may want to use the municipal law department. I will tell you that I partner with the municipal law department in a lot of places where we do work here in Florida, in Clearwater, in Orlando, here in Jacksonville with regard to the general employees system. I've partnered with city attorneys' offices in New Orleans and Los Angeles and other places too. I don't find that a partnership where some duties are done by by the city attorney's office and some are done by the board's lawyer is necessarily inconsistent with this duty of loyalty. But it has to be the client's choice. And they have to say when they need to use one office versus another. Now, I think there are some circumstances in which there's probably cost savings that are available with regard to use of municipal services. I think public records issues is one, because everybody's subject to the same public records issues. Everybody's subject to the same open meetings law. And we've actually used the general counsel's office in the past. We had in a prior building that the Police and Fire Pension Fund owned, we had a zoning issue. And we used the municipal law department to represent us in front of the code enforcement or zoning board. I forget which one it was. So I think that that's fine. And I think partnership is fine. And so that's not an issue. But for the trustees themselves, they need to know that whoever represents them, whether it's an actuary or an accounting firm or a lawyer or a financial advisor, they need to know that's their advisor. And since they're paying the bill, they ought to be the ones that make the choice. And that's my view on that issue. And by the way, as far as fiduciary duty goes, I think Mr. Keene answered the question for you correctly. One of the greatest jurists in the history of our country was Benjamin Cardozo, who before he was on the U.S. Supreme Court was Chief Justice of the New York Court of Appeals, which is the equivalent of the Florida Supreme Court. And he wrote in a case in the 1920s and said that fiduciary duty involves a standard of behavior that's above the morals of the marketplace, that you have a duty really second to none in the law. And our own U.S. Supreme Court said later, talking about pension funds, that any pension, anybody serving a pension fund, or any trustee or fiduciary of a pension fund who claims to be able to serve two masters or two mistresses equally well actually serves neither. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that fall into my area of responsibility.
I've got two. Number one, would you comment on the charter provision that, and in the charter, the fund is named as an independent agency of the city?
Yes.
And the charter provides that the general counsel's opinion shall be binding on all councils and agencies and boards of the city. Would you comment on that provision?
I can. The pension fund was created by a special act of the legislature, originally back, the very first one during World War I. The current plan that we have now has its origins in the 1930s. The present charter provision for the police and fire pension is Article 22 or Chapter 22 of the charter. It's a later enactment of the legislature than the section which created the general counsel's office responsibility. It also specifically says within it that Chapters 175 and 185 are adopted, and that specifically empowers a pension fund to either hire its own lawyer or use the services of the municipal attorney in such manner as the board deems appropriate. It's also obviously the later expression of the legislature in time, so I think that clearly, since one is supposed to read provisions of any law or series of laws in pari materia, which is about the extent of my Latin, which means we read them in harmony with one another, that's why I come to the conclusion that that's essentially the board's choice.
But if we change the charter, and the charter also provides that the board can employ its counsel, but if we change the charter by amendment, that would be a later act than the statutory act.
Except that you have this general law. You know, the city gets, I don't know, $8 or $10 million a year from Chapter 175 and 185 money. And the general law, which governs and establishes the power of all boards of trustees, says that they can use their own lawyer or use the municipal lawyer as they deem appropriate. So I think there'd really have to be a change in the general law for that to occur. And then in the end, what governs all behavior of lawyers is the Code of Professional Responsibility, which essentially is there for the protection of the clients rather than for the protection of the hired help. And if the client believes there's a conflict, then the client can go out and hire another lawyer. So that ultimately leaves the decision in the hands of the Board of Trustees. And while we happen to have a fine general counsel today, I don't know what tomorrow's going to hold. And one of the reasons why the city uses me for the city retirement system is because while they have very fine lawyers up there on the 4th floor, some are generalists, some are specialists, but nobody's been doing public pension work for 37 years like I have. And that's why that's why the city hires lots of lawyers on the outside. For bonds, sometimes for special litigation issues, and in my case, for pensions, because what we do is employee benefits.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Ted?
Well, Bob, one of the reasons, I know you've done very well as a pension attorney and represent a lot of pension funds, and the primary reason is because my grandmother taught you in the 2nd grade.
That's correct.
And I appreciate it.
Mrs. Delagal at Hendricks Avenue, Public School number 71. And she was a fine woman.
She still is.
She still is? Wow, I'm sorry. I'm surprised I'm still here.
But a lot of the legal work, and I think one of the things that has been pointed out, and we're trying to, I know there are times in which there are major issues, and those matters may involve serious conflicts with the city of Jacksonville in terms of the interpretation of the duties of the Board of Trustees and the pension fund, those types of things, and you're certainly involved in some of that litigation now. But in general, most of the legal work on behalf of a pension fund, from what I can see, and I've been involved mainly in suing pension funds, so that's my perspective, is most of the work is fairly routine matters in terms of challenging the amount of benefits that somebody is getting, determining whether or not somebody is entitled to one set of benefits versus another set of benefits, looking at the calculations that are used. And while as I understand the proposals, we're not saying that the pension fund cannot use outside counsel when there is a true conflict. And I think you're right, saying that the client always has that option when there is a conflict of interest. But shouldn't there be, and I mean, what is being proposed doesn't seem to me to be unreasonable, given the fact that the bulk of the cases should be able to be performed by a very capable general counsel's office that is available to do that. And certainly somebody like yourself could provide guidance or support or whatever if necessary. But it would seem to me that that would be a good, effective cost savings.
I'm a great believer that litigation, which is the biggest cost driver in any corporate organization, is always the last resort, because I'm a great believer that the lawyer is ultimately the beneficiary of litigation. Most of the litigation that we've had in the 26 years that I've been doing the legal work for the fund has been where somebody sued us, and not where we sued anybody else. In all this time, I think we sued the state once to clarify our investment authority, and we settled it fairly quickly with a interpretation of the statute. Every other time somebody has sued us. I mean, we've been sued, you and I, and there's no secret, I've known you forever, and I can remember 2 suits that you've been involved in. One had to do with surviving spouses who remarry, and there was a suit filed in federal court, and the judge agreed with the fund. And then there was one recently involving a firefighter's benefit, and the court agreed with your client. And we just had a decision Friday on a matter from Judge Cole where it had to do with, again, survivor benefits, and Judge Cole said the board did everything right, and that's the end. So I think the answer is the board should look to their general counsel and say, is there a way to do this less expensively? And I'd be the first one to tell them, yes, if I thought there was somebody in the municipal attorney's office that could have handled the thing, I'm the first one to say. I don't do real estate, for example, transactional real estate. All of our real estate transactions, I recommended we hired somebody else.
Sure. So what I understood, though, when you were speaking earlier, is you wouldn't have any objection, nor would the fund, on a division of responsibilities to certain matters being handled by the general counsel's office.
As long as the fund makes that decision, no.
So where you would object is having that decision made by the general counsel rather than the trustees of the fund.
Correct, because I don't think the lawyer tells the client when they hire them.
Okay.
It's the other way around.
Just want to clear that. Yes, Kirsten.
And I'm assuming you've had the opportunity to look at our proposal.
I have.
Okay. So there was one sentence that I was just really struggling with, and inartfully, I think, at our last meeting, and I'd like to get your comments on it. It's the very first sentence of
I do not have it in front of me. Ted, can I borrow it? Yeah, sure.
So page 3 and paragraph 3, the first sentence of that paragraph, after use of office leader.
Yes.
And so basically this sentence just seeks an acknowledgement by the fund that the city's general counsel's opinions are final and binding on it, just like any other agency. And that just struck me as wildly inconsistent with the fund's duties, and I'd like for your thoughts on that.
I agree, and here's why.
Thank you.
Here's why. The charter says, and the state statutes for public pension funds say, not just for police and fire, but for all of them, and Florida has what's called its own little ERISA statute for public funds, which is found in Part 7 of Chapter 112 of the Florida statutes, and I helped write that one back in the 70s. And what it basically says is there's one fiduciary for the fund, and that's the Board of Trustees. And so to be able to have the lawyer tell the client, not only is this my advice, but this is what you have to do, it turns fiduciary responsibility on its head and places it all on the lawyer. And, trustees bear specific responsibility for these issues. Now, I will tell you, I give advice all the time, and clients say, thank you, counselor, we appreciate it, and they go in the diametrically opposed direction. And sometimes it works out for them, and sometimes they come back to me and say, can you clean this up? And I think that's probably true for any professional, whether it's a doctor or an engineer or a financial advisor who says, I recommend you do this. I think advice is just that. It's advice. But ultimately, the person with the responsibility has to be the person that makes the decision. And while contractually we make ourselves fiduciaries to both pension funds that we work for here, both city pension funds, ultimately the decisions have to be made by the boards of trustees. And that's true not just here, but in all of the pension funds that we do work for, whether we're special counsel, primary counsel, co-counsel with an attorney general's office or a city or county municipal, law department. And I think what the city charter is intended to say is for the city government that is advised by the general counsel, he or she gives an opinion, and that opinion is the legal opinion. Now, whether they have to run the government that way, suppose the general counsel gave an opinion that said the city council can't raise taxes, just for whatever reason. That would be binding on the council's ability to raise revenue? Of course not. City council members in Jacksonville, who are also county commissioners for the county of Duval, are constitutional officers of the state of Florida. They got elected to make those decisions. The general counsel is an appointed official who's intended as an advisor. What I really think that provision was intended to do is to keep the finance department from fighting with the water department and fighting with the zoo or the library, each one of whom might have had their own lawyers, because within the structure that reports to the mayor, which is basically everybody except the council, I think that was intended to provide for some uniformity within that structure. I don't think it was intended to turn an unelected appointed official into a substitute determination maker for the entire consolidated government.
Thank you. Other questions?
Yeah, just one.
Sherry?
So you've been the fund's legal counsel for a number of years, and I think we heard you say that if your client asks you, could this be handled by general counsel or somebody else less expensively, you would opt for that. This language is for its ordinary and customary legal needs. Can you help us know, on balance, what the record shows? Do you, as legal counsel, normally recommend to your client that they use the city's general counsel for so-called ordinary and customary legal needs?
It depends on what the client wants. There are times when I'll say to the client, there's somebody less expensive you could hire to do this, or somebody who's more skilled in a particular area. We farm out all of the real estate work for all of our clients. Investment work we keep in-house, meaning the investment management agreements, because there's very specialized knowledge involved in those that we've developed over the years. There may be certain circumstances where it would involve, say, an issue of a municipality issuing a pension obligation bond. I'd say go get a bond lawyer, because while I'm familiar with it and knowledgeable, I don't profess to be an expert. Mainly it would be about where can the skill needed be most efficiently provided. And I used public records for an example, because the pension fund generally uses the city as its public records keeper, even though we, other than what I would call our member files, which is the confidential information for our firefighters and police officers, retirees, medical information, and that sort of stuff, which we have a specific statutory obligation to preserve. But we've had some litigation, and quite frankly, most of the litigation we've had in the last few years has been over public records issues. It wouldn't bother me if the general counsel's office were to handle that stuff going forward. I'm agnostic on the subject. We're perfectly capable of handling it. We've handled a lot of them. We're handling them right now in a number of other places, not just in Florida, but in other states as well. But if in talking it over with the general counsel's office, they had a better mousetrap, I'm open to that. we end up discounting our bill every month because it's been high because of litigation. If you look prior to the current spate of litigation we've had beginning, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, our bills were considerably less than they are now. And you see in months where there's no substantial litigation activity, the bills are, 40% of what they are in the high months.
Thank you. Other questions? Let me, maybe you or John King would, I don't know who's the right one to answer. Y'all did not address or respond to the part of the memo that dealt with the return to collective bargaining. Is that something?
At the conclusion of the however many years the agreement ends,
Right.
there was that we don't have a dog in that race. We're not in the bargaining business. That would be an issue that should be discussed with the unions. In my long history of working with employees in Jacksonville, the city had a policy of not wanting to bargain pensions back in the 70s, and that continued on. The agreement, which is we've called the 30-year agreement, is actually the product of litigation over how the Chapter 175 and 185 money would be utilized. And I think what happened is within the framework of that agreement, the city was comfortable with not taking unilateral action, and the unions were comfortable in not demanding bargaining over the issue. They could demand bargaining over the issue whenever they want. I taught labor law in law school for 17 years and also taught a master's program for 2 different universities on labor relations. But what essentially the Florida law is as follows. Florida is one of 3 states that embodies collective bargaining in the state constitution. But the right to bargain belongs to workers. It doesn't belong to the employer. Employers have the right to take unilateral action, and then unions have the right to demand bargaining, both the decision and the consequences of the decision, and there's a framework within Florida law for how all that gets resolved. The pension fund's not a union. We're not a bargaining agent. We're, I realize there's an opinion to the contrary, but collective bargaining's between them. The board's concern is to see this process through. And when I see it through, I mean the long-term stability of the retirement system. Because what's happening in Jacksonville, which, as someone who has a long stake in the city, my family immigrated to North Florida directly from Europe more than 100 years ago. And so I grew up here. My mother was born here. And so I have a long relationship with the city and great affection for it. And what all of this has been is we're concerned about stability. And what all of this difficulty over pension has done is firefighters and police officers are retiring at an alarming rate. And they're not born fully formed. You got to train them, and it takes a while to learn how to do it right. Having been a legal advisor in a police department and having represented all 64 sheriffs in Louisiana for a long time, I can tell you, police officers, no matter how smart or talented they are, it takes a few years to learn where everything is. And having represented firefighters for 35 years, I can tell you it takes a while to learn how to drive the truck. Wait for the garage door to go up before you drive the truck all the way out. The lights fall off. The point being that we're losing people that it's costing a fortune to replace. And what should not happen is for Jacksonville to turn into a training ground for other cities in Florida or in the Southeast, where everybody says, hey, let's go to Jacksonville. They're hiring, they got huge turnover, we'll learn the job there, we'll get certified there, and we'll take those skills to a place where the employment relationship is more stable. Town of Palm Beach radically reduced its pension benefits last year. And they gave up the state money, which in the context of their budget wasn't a lot. But it was predicted that they would lose 25% of their workforce as a result of it. In fact, 40% of the firefighters and police officers left. Could you imagine trying to protect the citizens in a city of this size if 40% of the workforce left? The other problem you have here, you have a very mature workforce, meaning they're advanced in years of service and they're getting up there in age. And it means they can go at a moment's notice, and that's a real concern. So this is me speaking my opinion. I think that the reason to see this through and the reason that I think bargaining's right after the agreement is gone is because we will have, I believe, stabilized the finances, not placed an undue strain on the public fisc, and have a clear understanding of what the rules are for everybody. And once the waters are calm, then the difficult give and take of collective bargaining should emerge, and the parties have it out. Now, I know there's different legal opinions about whether it goes now or goes then. I get all that.
Including Judge Wallace's.
No question.
Yeah.
And
Okay, other questions? Because what I want to do, what my game plan here is to hear from Cindy Laquadera, the General Counsel, then let's take a break, and we'll come back and hear from the mayor. And
thank you. I apologize if I ran on.
Okay. No, you didn't at all. This was very helpful. And John Keene, thank you. This is one thing we have really, we as I've said before, we have really got to restore relationships in this city too. So, Ms. Laquadera. Thank you, Bob, very much. Yeah.
A few things on the specialty of consolidation. And this is, I would just as soon not have binding opinion. I agree as a political science matter, it should lie with the elected officials. But nonetheless, under the charter, other people have decided otherwise. Our elected officials, 19 council members, 5 countywide constitutional officers, are bound by the opinion. And every independent agency is, including the Police and Fire Pension Fund. A number of them were passed by special act of the legislature. And the best way to understand this is in corporate law, you have the powers granted to you. A subsidiary of Coke typically is not given the power to sue Coke. And that's the philosophy behind the consolidated government. So when the attorney gives an opinion, if it's on the charter, that's the end of it. If it's on state law, then the Attorney General, anybody can ask for an opinion from the Attorney General. So to the extent state law is applicable, that's generally where it goes. We have, when I came on board as the then Chief Deputy, I hired Mr. Clauser, among others, because we need and will always need an expertise on tax and pension-related matters. But the day-to-day matters really should be part of that consolidated government because then they're cohesive. The city doesn't control the police and fire pension fund records. That's been an issue of continuing dispute. We had to pay 35 cents to get an agenda. Okay? So no, we don't control the documents. We do have in our office, since Mr. Mulaney's tenure and mine, 7 judges, including 3 federal magistrates. I think they know their duties under Florida law. And so the whole thought of consolidation is one opinion. It's an issue on the law. It's not a political opinion. So I would just say that on issues of consolidation, you really should leave those, that they should always have retained by the general counsel and the pension board. That's how we do with every client, too. The client and the general counsel select outside counsel when there's an expertise. By definition, pension law, you're going to need a pension law expert. Doesn't mean that's the person on public documents. It doesn't mean it's a person on labor issues or on litigation defending a disability policy. For that, I think the office could do that more in a lot better way. But there isn't any issue in terms of conflicts and things of that nature under our consolidated government, because it is a power not granted to these independent agencies.
Thank you, Cindy. Ted?
Yeah, Cindy, first of all, I'd just like to note that you pronounce the word charter the way I pronounce a certain type of soup.
I usually spell it when there's a stenographer. Yeah.
But has there ever been, and I understand what you're saying about the general counsel being able to give binding opinions, are there any judicial opinions as to the power of the general counsel?
Yes, there's the opinion by Judge Weatherby, which I can provide to you, and there's 1 or 2 other judges that say if it's an interpretation of the charter, then that is a matter that it lies within the consolidated government, and they've given that final authority to the general counsel. If it's an issue of state law, then, of course, the AG can be asked.
One other question, and I know we all have, when you have questions of are legal expenses warranted, are they necessary, are we spending too much on certain legal expenses? It could either be a problem, if there are problems with legal expenses, it could be the client being unreasonable, it could be the attorney overbilling, not necessarily the hourly rate. Do you have any means by which you've done audits of certain situations, or you could go behind and try to do that for the benefit of maybe an agency such as the pension fund to see where the problem is?
We can look at, if there's an issue on large expenses, we can look, our billing rates, of course, are about half.
But billing rates don't
but
matter. I mean, it's the end product.
It's the overall
Right.
matter, and we don't make a profit, so if we bill 1,000 hours, it doesn't matter if we bill 1,000 or 500. But that's actually a simple comparison of the number of hours worked and the billing rates, because, of course, Mr. Claus's firm has a good reputation for not making work.
No, but I understand, but what I'm wondering is this. Is there any way to go in and say, okay, this year we spent X number of dollars on legal fees. Maybe we need to have somebody go in, evaluate how this process worked. How can we do it better in the future so that we don't spend as much money next year?
We do that for when we see a pattern of issues with our clients. We'll see that this is something causing litigation, and so we've done that pretty naturally. And the CEOs typically will look at their budget. If there's a bust, then they'll typically ask us to sit down and provide that guidance on whether it's something that could have been avoidable.
Okay, thank you. I know
Thank you.
that talking about lawyers is not something that non-lawyers like to really talk about, but it is important in our context. I saw Councilwoman Boyer had come in. We're glad you're here, Lori. Thank you for being with us. We're going to take a 10-minute break. It's 2:20 now. We'll come back at 2:30. And I think Chris or the mayor, y'all be prepared to make your presentation. Thank you very much. We're a lot closer than
Thank you, Chairman Shai, task force members, and Pew Charitable Trust team. I also want to thank Police and Fire Pension Fund Administrator John King for his presentation. As a task force, you have provided the final burst of momentum needed to achieve retirement reform, and I'm very grateful for your efforts. We can all agree on one thing. The issue of retirement reform has hovered over Jacksonville for long enough. Let's achieve retirement reform now. Last week, the financial markets gave us a powerful reminder of the need for speed. On Thursday, Moody's rating agency announced that Jacksonville was one of 256 American cities being placed on credit review for the next 90 days. Moody's also announced that it was increasing the importance of pension in its credit assessment. We need to deliver if we want to maintain and enhance our city's already strong credit rating. A downgrade in that credit rating would not only hurt our city prestige, but also hurt taxpayers. Let's achieve retirement reform now. Taxpayers need us to achieve reform so we can stabilize our annual contribution to the Police and Fire Pension Fund and provide quality services to the citizens of our community. Sheriff Rutherford and Chief Senefit need us to achieve reform so they can retain and recruit without uncertainty about pensions. Let's achieve retirement reform now. We must finish this as soon as possible so that taxpayers, the city employees, and the rating agencies know that Jacksonville means business. You are scheduled to compete the task force process no later than February 12, 2014. Following your recommendations, my administration will move quickly to work with police and fire employees the Police and Fire Pension Fund, and City Council to make retirement reform a reality. Taxpayers need closure. Our city employees need closure. If we move quickly, we will send a strong message of resolve to the financial markets. Let's achieve retirement reform now. This task force has correctly identified 3 ways to build on the foundation laid by the previous retirement reform agreement. First, we should ensure governance that promotes accountability, transparency, and increased investment performance at the Police and Fire Pension Fund. Second, we should design a pension benefit structure that's both affordable and competitive. Third, we should accelerate the payment of the unfunded liability. The task force has already done a strong job on addressing the issue of governance. Today, my team and I will present a comprehensive plan that expands upon our previous agreement and addresses the other 2 areas. We believe this plan protects taxpayers and respects city employees. In the months since City Council defeated the previous agreement, my team and I have closely analyzed the concerns that City Council members and external stakeholders voiced about the agreement. We've heard observation that the City Council members made while previous agreement was pending. We reviewed Civic Council and Jack's Chamber letters and the TU's editorials. We've listened very closely to your comments and opinions at these task force meetings. We have reflected on previous agreement and the view that John Keene and police and fire employees have expressed about retirement reform. We have incorporated all of this input into a comprehensive plan that we are presenting today. On governance, you have already made smart and innovative proposals to enhance oversight at the Police and Fire Pension Fund. I appreciate this huge contribution to the critical and often overlooked governance issue. While I still believe strongly that the city should appoint the 5th member of the Police and Fire Pension Fund Board of Trustees, the governance proposal that Chairman Shai and the task force have made takes us in the right direction. Today, this proposal keeps the benefit reform for new employees that will have in a previous agreement. Some expressed concerns that the previous agreement did not seek, and I quote, shared sacrifice from current employees. As my administration has previously explained to this task force, Florida law protects benefits already earned by retired or current employees. That limits our ability to impact annual city contributions or unfunded liability through changes in the benefit plan for current employees. In light of the Florida law, and as a matter of fairness and competitiveness, I have concerns about major changes to the current employees' benefit package. But today, we're proposing 3 adjustments related to the current employees. First, we propose a new schedule for current employees to increase their pension contribution. Under our proposal, current police and fire employees will see an immediate increase in their pension contribution from 7% to 8%. As soon as the city restores the 2% pay cut the fire employees took in 2010, the police employees took in 2012, the pension contribution for the current police and fire employees would increase from 8% to 10%. Second, we propose to modify the guaranteed rate of return for current employees who are not yet eligible for the Deferred Retirement Option Program, known as DROP. Right now, DROP benefits earn a guaranteed 8.4 rate of return. Under our proposal, DROP benefits would earn the actual rate of return subject to a cap of 10% and a floor of 0%. This is the same range identified in our backdrop proposal for new employees. Third, we propose to modify the cost of living adjustment, COLA, for current employees on an ongoing forward basis. Police and fire employees currently receive a guarantee of 3% COLA. Under our proposal, the COLA on benefits earned in the past would not change. but the COLA on the benefit earned in the future would be capped at 1.5% tied to the Social Security of COLA. This is the same COLA that new employees would receive on all of their benefits. We believe these proposed changes will address the desire to have current employees participate in a retirement reform solution without unduly impacting our ability to recruit and retain first responders. On the unfunded liability, I have previously said that the city should commit itself to doubling the funded status of police, fire, and pension fund and increase its fund approximately from 40% to 80% as soon as physically prudent. Governance changes can help reduce the unfunded liability if they increase investment returns. Reforms to the benefit structure will also reduce the unfunded liability. But we need to do more, and the question is how. I know that some task force members have suggested devoting around $200 million a year from the general fund budget to the city's police and fire pension contribution. However, I would urge you to keep in mind what Chairman Schy and Charlie Appleby said at the last task force meeting. There has to be a balance. While we want to get to 80% funded status as quickly as possible, we also need to preserve city services that contributes to the quality of life. $200 million annually is a heavy burden for the city general fund to bear if we want to fund libraries, parks, public works, economic development, and other critical priorities. Some of the task force members had suggested increasing taxes as a means for accelerating payment of the unfunded liability. I respect that there are different opinions about raising taxes, but I cannot support a tax increase. Our economy is growing, but the growth is fragile. Many of our fellow citizens are still struggling to remain in their homes and keep their jobs or businesses. Just the other day, the Times-Union had a major article on foreclosures with those families who own habitat homes, putting sweat equity in these homes, and all of a sudden we see that they too are struggling. Foreclosures is the #1 issue in Jacksonville. We're ranked #1 in the country. But we do not need to raise taxes to achieve comprehensive retirement reform. We can accelerate the payment of unfunded liability through partnership. As you know, Jacksonville Electric Authority is the city's largest financial partner. Many JEA employees are in the city general employee pension plan, so our utility also has a stake in the overall retirement reform. Since the last time I spoke to you, our team has been meeting with JEA. While we have not yet concluded those discussions, I'm confident that we will find a way to partner that supports the JEA's bottom line and provide the city with a sustainable funding source to accelerate the payment of our unfunded liability. The plan we're presenting today assumes that we can reach an agreement with JEA to increase our contribution by an additional $40 million annually until the police and fire pension fund is 80% funded. If the city is willing to make innovative contributions toward reducing the unfunded liability, I would respectfully suggest that police and fire fund do the same. At present, the state provides approximately $9 million in so-called chapter funds to the police, fire, and pension fund. Half of these funds go to help pay the cost of base pension benefits. The other half are dedicated to enhance pension benefits. As a part of a final agreement, I hope the fund agrees to devote the $4.5 million in annual enhanced benefit chapter funds to the unfunded liability until the fund status reaches 80%. You've heard a lot of information this afternoon. Let's get to the bottom line. According to our actuary, this proposal would save the general fund $2.75 billion over 35 years. It would stabilize our annual contribution to the police and fire pension fund. It would raise the fund status of the police and fire pension fund from 39% today to 80% in fiscal year 2028 before the end of the next decade. While I am finished, our city retirement reform team will walk you through the details of this comprehensive proposal and the associated numbers. Mr. Chairman, and to the task force members, thank you again for your time today and for your selfless service to our community. We really make these suggestions in the spirit of cooperation, collaboration, coordination, in the hope that they assist your work over these final meetings. There is no question that this is the issue in the 21st century for cities all around the country, but this is the issue that we're faced with today. And as mayor, I'm going to continue to work with the task force and everyone to really take Jacksonville to the next level, to close this gap once and for all, to put us on a financial footing, sustainable financial footing, to make sure that the next generation of first responders and city employees will not have to deal with this issue. I am truly thankful for all the time and effort you all are putting in this. This is not an easy task. This is a lot of work, but it is my conviction, my moral obligation. Most mayors in this country would not touch this issue for a lot of obvious reasons, and we need to be honest about that. But I decided when I ran that I would make this a top priority of my administration because I believe that Jacksonville is one of the best cities in America. I don't think any city in the country has the assets that we have, the intellectual capital that we have, a great business community, a great civic community, a great city that really believes in opportunity for all, a great not-for-profit community that invests all around our city each and every day. And I believe that with each and every one of you, we have an opportunity to really get it right and do it right. And think about those who've already paid the price and retired. Think about those who really believe in public service, and I still believe that is a noble thing. To think about those who are on the front line every day, police and fire. Promise made, promise kept. We should keep our promise to those who work hard on our behalf every day. City employees love their city. They believe in their city, just like first responders. We're all in this together, and I know by working together, we can get it done. Let's achieve retirement reform now, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this opportunity, and I will now like to bring up Chris Hand and the team to go through the presentation. You're going to see a slide presentation, go through the numbers, go through the charts, so it can be very clear on what we're recommending. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, if I might take a couple of minutes just to sort of run through the proposal the mayor is making today so you understand all of the financials in it, and then the team and I are happy to answer any questions you might have. As the mayor said, the goal here today is, as you are continuing your work, to kind of make what we hope will be some helpful suggestions, just sort of based on the work the administration's done. Obviously, we had an agreement with the Police and Fire Pension Fund in 2013. As the mayor said, this proposal builds upon that agreement to help address some of the areas of concern that were raised during the council process last year. So, just some financial highlights of this proposal. Our actuary has scored it and indicates that it will save the general fund $2.75 billion over 35 years. Now, we ran a little bit different time frame than the last one. The last agreement we had, we scored over a 30-year period. This takes it to the middle of this century to sort of make sure that we know for the first half of this century exactly what our obligations would be. It's also consistent with the way that prior agreements, such as Mayor Payton's 2011 399, were scored, so we were trying to achieve some consistency. So the savings to the general fund over a 35-year period would be $2.75 billion. To use a shorter time frame, it reduces the city's general fund pension payments by $130 million over the next 5 years. So we'd be paying $130 million less from the general fund, and that's important, and we'll get into that in a little while, than we would but for the agreement with this status quo. And then the key element of funded status, under this proposal, we would achieve an 80% funded status. You heard Mr. Keene earlier say that that's really the gold standard for a well-funded pension plan. It would achieve that status by fiscal year 2028, so essentially 13 and a half, 14 years from now. This is going to look very similar because the new employee pension design in this proposal is exactly the same as what was in the mediated settlement agreement. So I don't want to dwell on this. I know you've already studied that, reviewed it, asked some questions about it. We're happy to follow up on it. But the new employee pension design is exactly, for each element, the same as it was in the mediated settlement agreement. And you remember at the time, there was significant consensus among a variety of stakeholders that the benefit changes made there were significant and were very well received. Just to kind of remind you, and you've seen this slide before as well, just to put those new employee benefit changes into context, as you know, we tend to use as a basis for comparison the Florida retirement system because 65 of 67 counties have their county employees in the Florida retirement system. If Jacksonville were not consolidated, our county employees might be as well. On a number of key elements, this plan is as or more aggressive than the Florida retirement system is on a number of different benefits. So just to put into perspective and context, the significant changes those new employee benefits make, that gives you a basis of comparison. You might also remember, and we haven't sort of demonstrated it here, but I believe it was back in June of 2013, the Times Union did a comparison with other municipalities that are not an FRS, Orlando, I think Fort Lauderdale was another one, perhaps Tampa, where again, the reforms we were making here were aggressive as compared to those. So these are very significant reforms for new employees and do save a good chunk of that $2.75 billion over time. Where you begin to see the changes in this proposal from the from the previous settlement agreement are in current employees. Now, as Mayor Brown said in his speech, the goal here was to address the concerns that current employees, the people wanted them to participate more in the retirement reform solution, but do so with a delicate balance so as not to dissuade people from continuing serving with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office or the Jacksonville Fire Rescue Department. So we've suggested 3 changes as it relates to current employees. Most of their benefits would remain exactly the same as they are now, but the 3 changes are as follows, and I'll sort of take them in reverse order. The employee contribution right now is 7%. In our previous settlement agreement, we had proposed a schedule and a mechanism for that to get up to 9% over time. After the pay cut, after the 2010-2012 pay cut was restored, subsequent pay increases would go to help lift the employee contribution. This accelerates that process by a bit. In other words, under this proposal, the employee contribution would go from 7% to 8% immediately upon implementation of this plan, if this were to be the one that was implemented, and then it would rise to 10%. So at that point, you'd have current and new employees paying the same contribution as soon as the city restores the pay cut that police officers took, that firefighters took in 2010 and that police officers took in 2012. So it ties that final 2% to the restoration of those cuts. That's similar to the way we did in the settlement agreement, but this moves up that schedule so that the 10% contribution is reached sooner than it would have been before. Another change here is in drop. As you know, for new employees, the drop program is abolished and replaced with something called backdrop. And with backdrop, participants earn the actual rate of return on the plan, subject to a rate floor of 0% and a rate ceiling of 10%. This is the exact same model that would be used for current employees who are not already eligible for the drop program. So if you're a police officer or firefighter who's not yet eligible for drop, rather than getting that guaranteed 8.4% rate of return, you would now get the actual return as the investment return on your drop benefits, again, subject to that rate floor of 0% and that rate cap of 10%. And then finally, last but not least, COLA. Right now, current employees enjoy a 3% guaranteed COLA. The change we would make here is not for any benefits earned already. Under the law, the benefits they've earned would be subject to that 3% COLA. But for any benefits earned in the future, rather than having a guaranteed 3% COLA, the COLA would be capped at 1.5% and tied to the Social Security COLA. So Social Security COLA was 1% in a particular year, that would be the COLA for current employees. If it were 2%, it would be 1.5%. As you might recall, this is exactly the same COLA that new employees will receive from all of their benefits going forward in the previous agreement. This just expands that to current employees and their benefits moving forward. Let me talk a little bit more about the payment of unfunded liability. There are obviously three sources of paying down the unfunded liability in this proposal. Obviously, part of our annual required contribution each year, part of it goes to the normal cost, the cost of supporting benefits for the plan, but the other portion goes to helping to pay down the unfunded liability. So that's just one that we all assume is there. The mayor referred to a supplemental payment from the Jacksonville Electrical Authority, JEA, until the Police and Fire Pension Fund reaches 80% funded status, which under this would be roughly 14 years. So the idea would be that you would have this separate payment outside the general fund that would go toward paying down the unfunded liability until the Police and Fire Pension Fund reaches 80% status. And then the final portion is what the mayor referred to in his remarks. Right now, we get approximately $9 million per year in so-called chapter benefits from the state of Florida. Half of those, or $4.5 million, go to the base benefits of the plan. Right now, the other half, the other 4.5, go towards so-called enhanced benefits. As part of this proposal, we would suggest that that other half, which is going to enhanced benefits, instead go to pay down the unfunded liability until such time as the plan reaches 80% funded status, so for the next 14 years. And that's sort of a share and share alike proposal. If the city is going to work and partner with JEA to find this additional revenue source that it can put into the plan, then we believe it's fair to ask the Police and Fire Pension Fund to agree to dedicate that additional half of chapter funds to the unfunded liability for that period of time. Okay, so I'm going to show you some charts and show you how the numbers kind of pull together, and this will be an area particularly where Mr. Grivey, who's our treasurer, and Mr. Tzubi, who's our actuary, will probably need to kind of jump in and provide some additional detail on how we've done things. These charts, this analysis assumes a 7.0 rate of return. The actuarial assumption is 7.0, exactly what we have in the plan each year. And to the task force's point in previous meetings, we're actually paying in, because we've got that additional funding source, at something less than 7.0. I don't believe it's 5.4, but it's something less than 7.0, but it assumes a 7.0 rate of return. You'll see on the charts that it uses the uncombined amortization method that Florida Retirement System uses, that a majority of Florida municipalities use, and in fact the Police and Fire Pension Fund used until the last couple of years. This is the standard practice, and you'll see that it has the effect of sort of flattening out the city's contribution so there's sort of better stability over time. And the third thing this does is similar to the mediation settlement agreement. It applies the now $24 million there's an enhanced benefit account at the Police and Fire Pension Fund, which had $20 million at the time of our previous settlement agreement, now has $24 million in it. It would apply that money to help the city with its annual required contribution in the first 4 years of this proposal. And the reason we did that is, obviously we all hope and anticipate that city revenues are going to begin to rebound over time as the economy rebounds. But in these initial years, it is helpful, we believe, and appropriate to do what we suggested doing in the mediation settlement agreement, which is taking these funds to kind of help the city with its payment in the initial years. Now, one of the big pieces of feedback we received from the mediation settlement agreement, from this group and others, that agreement would have taken the $20 million and helped the city with a 1-year assistance defrayment of its ARC. Based on the feedback from some council members, a number of them, including some a few inches from me right now, there was a suggestion that maybe it would be smarter, and we agree, to pay this down, to pay that over a spread period of time, so that you don't aggregate everything in 1 year, but you provide some assistance year over year. So the way we split up the $24 million is $8 million in the next fiscal year, $7 million in each of the next 2 fiscal years, and then $2 million in fiscal year 18. We believe that is, based on the very good feedback and advice we got, a more prudent way to distribute that $24 million to make sure that it is spread over time, and the city has some assistance from the budgeting side in these first few years as the economy is coming back. So let me show you some of the charts we've got to sort of analyze what the plan would do. Okay, the blue represents the current Police and Fire Pension Fund system. And you can see that sort of what we call the cliff effect where the annual contribution goes up and up and up, and then kind of comes off the cliff. That is something that when we first saw it, we had some concern about from a sort of a generational equity standpoint. I mean, is it really fair? Do you see where the cliff kind of occurs is right around fiscal year 37, and then you kind of dive off the cliff in fiscal year 38? There's a reasonable question there, which is it really fair to John and Jane Q taxpayer in fiscal year 37 that they've got, or excuse me, fiscal year 36, that they've got to pay a $481 million pension contribution, but a different set of taxpayers the next year has a dramatically smaller level. We didn't think it was, and looked at a number of options to deal with it, and our actuary said, listen, you could just uncombine the amortization, do like the Florida retirement system does and many other pension plans around the country do. So that's what we did, and along with the other changes we've built in, you can see the impact that has on our annual contribution. Next year alone, we would have paid $154 million as part of our ARC. That would drop to $136 million. And so what you're seeing is an impact that responds to another criticism of the mediated settlement agreement, which was under that agreement, people said most of the savings are at the back part of the plan. There's only a couple of years of savings, and you start going back up and up and up. Well, as you see here, you achieve savings year after year after year. Now still, because a lot of these changes affect new employees, a lot of the savings are kind of later in the plan. But this does provide some short-term savings as well. And just to be clear, you're comparing a combined approach with an uncombined approach, but it really does have the effect of flattening out what the city's contribution would be year in, year out. So again, just for next year alone, we paid $148 million for our police and fire pension contribution this year. According to this analysis, next year, under the proposal we're making, it would be $136 million. So a savings of $12 million, which is very significant in the sort of difficult budget times. While, again, we're hopeful about rebounding, again, that recovery has been a little bit slow when it's come to city revenues. So I want to help you put this in perspective a little bit. So this is how much the payment would be each year from fiscal year 15 all the way to fiscal year 48. But how does that fit into the larger city budget scheme? So we asked our budget office and our Treasury Department to do an analysis of what we think city revenues will look like over this period of time, just to kind of help put this in context. And so we ran two sets of numbers. One assumes a kind of 2% revenue increase per year. Some years you might be less, some years you might be more, but it assumes a 2% increase per year. The other assumes an even more conservative 1% increase over time. And what this will help show, and I'll go to those charts in 1 second, is just how much of our general fund budget we're going to have to, using this proposal, we're going to have to put into the police and fire pension fund. So this is where general fund revenue increases 2% per year. And as you can see, this has the effect over time of taking our percentage of the general fund, which right now, as Finance Chairman Anderson knows all too well, this year, 15% of our general fund budget is going toward our police and fire pension contribution. You can see over time how this proposal levels that off and then begins to move it toward a much more kind of manageable number. So, basically basically by the time you get to that 80% status, you're paying about 10% of your general fund budget toward police and fire pension contributions, and it does not rise above 10 going forward. There's a little, peaks and valleys, small peaks and valleys going forward. That's the nature of that uncombined amortization approach, but it doesn't rise above 10. That's with 2% per year growth in inflation. If you just assume a 1% rate per year, again, you see the same effect. It kind of starts at 15 and then slowly moves down till toward the end of the graph, you're in single digits. So we really wanted to put that in perspective. What will this proposal do over time to kind of right-size the percentage of our general fund budget we're putting into, that we're dedicating to our police and fire pension fund contributions. And it has exactly the effect that you want it to have, slowly over time, moving toward a reasonable, sustainable level in that regard. This also goes to, and Robert and Joey can speak to this better, the percentage of, is the percentage of payroll, percentage of salary? So percentage of covered payroll that we are putting into our pension contribution, again, same type impact. In the current fiscal year, our percentage of covered payroll is $111 million that we're putting into equals our pension contribution. Again, over time, as the benefit changes kick in, as the additional unfunded liability payments from the JEA kick in, that goes down until it is at a very reasonable level. I think we told you during the mediated settlement agreement that we had managed to sort of lower the city's contribution, its percentage of someone's salary to about a Social Security level, and that's more or less what's reflected here.
These are dollars. These are dollars.
Percent. Oh, I'm sorry, percent, right, exactly. Right. But I mean, that shows similar effect, just sort of different. Okay, so to the key questions related to the unfunded liability. This sort of tracks what this proposal would do for the unfunded liability over time. And as you can see, it hits that 80% mark kind of right on the border between fiscal year 28 and fiscal year 29. We don't yet know, by the way, and all this is based on the Police and Fire Pension Fund's 10-1-12 actuarial valuation. We have not seen their 10-1-13 valuation. We suspect that just sort of based on some of the improved returns over the last couple of years, that might actually move up the watermark, put the plan in a little bit better shape than it was as of 10-1-12. So that could actually move some of these numbers a year or two earlier. We're just not sure yet until we see that information.
You said fiscal year, but it's fiscal year 37, 38.
Yeah.
No. In other words, this, I'm not sure, Mr. Chairman, which question is this, well, what we're explaining is this, this would hit 80% status, the 80% funded status at fiscal year sort of 28, 29. Yeah. That gold standard that Mr. Keene referred to earlier, that's where you kind of cross that threshold. So you see what that would do to the funded status over time. In another 14 years, you would get to the 80% level. Okay, and then also sort of similar to that, the impact on the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. And this is one area, look, when you use that kind of combined method, that sort of cliff up and cliff down approach, you do pay off the overall unfunded liability a little bit more quickly under the baseline. Still do it quickly here. I think it's fiscal year 42 when you finally get to zero under our proposal. That's a few years later than under the baseline plan. But the benefit you gain in having that go a few years out, and it's natural that it go a few years out because you're, again, using the uncombined basis, paying it over 30 years as opposed to 23 years, is it gives you greater sustainability kind of during the period. Rather than going up and dropping down, you're sort of gently sloping down until you get to a point where that unfunded liability is paid off. So we think from and obviously we pay very close attention to this, from a city budgeting standpoint, this is much more doable and something the city could sustain over time if we can get agreement on going back to this method and utilizing some of these changes. So again, those are more or less the numbers. Joey or Robert, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Chris, let me just ask a quick question.
Sure.
I'm looking at where it says adjusted city contribution millions. There's not a page number.
Contribution rate or contribution amount?
Adjusted city contribution.
Okay, and that's the first chart?
Yep. Is this net of the increased JEA contribution?
No, this is what would come out of the general fund. So in other words, each year when we pay our ARC, this is the amount that would be budgeted.
I understand.
From the
So
city.
in addition to that?
In addition to that would be the, in this model, $40 million from the JEA. So that would be a separate supplemental payment, separate and apart from the general fund.
But the models don't reflect that.
No, the models do assume that $40 million payment from
That's
the
my
JEA.
question.
Yes, they do.
That's what I wanted to make sure
They do.
everybody understood.
They do. The models do assume that $40 million. Those obviously have an impact on the ARC and
the chapter funds and the enhancement.
It assumes, sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman, I should have made that clear. This model assumes all of those separate unfunded liability payments I referred to earlier. It assumes the $40 million from JEA. It assumes the $4.5 million from the Police and Fire Pension Fund.
So just to be clear, to be repetitive, in fiscal year 15, 154 would be increased by 8, to 162 plus 40 is to 202.
You're looking at the wrong number.
Yeah,
So
you're
the
looking at
136, you got to look at the bottom.
I'm sorry, 136, right, right,
Yeah.
right. So that's plus 40 is 176 plus 8 is pretty close to 190.
Well, it's right around, the additional 40 would put you at 176, the other 4 after that, closer to 180. But again, the key is what's coming out of the general fund. That's why we were really careful to make that distinction. This would be having an additional funding source not in the general fund that would make that supplemental unfunded liability.
Sherry?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. The obvious question, what makes the administration think that JEA has $40 million to contribute to the city for this? And the follow-up is, and without a rate increase for ratepayers?
Well, we could have gone to the DuPont Fund, but we thought we'd start with JEA.
I'm sorry, but we've already given to the city.
We actually think there's a real opportunity for partnership here, and we've had initial meetings with JEA to sort of discuss this, and we're continuing to discuss it. We think that the city can help JEA with some savings opportunities. For example, right now JEA is part of the general employees pension plan. If they had, for example, their own pension plan, that would be an opportunity to save significantly on their annual pension contribution and be able to do so forever, not just for 14 years, but be able to do so forever. So one of the things we're doing, Sherry, in trying to forge that partnership is to ask JEA the question. I mean, we were, when we first met with them, we were pretty direct. We said, look, what the city needs is money. I mean, we're looking for ways to help pay down that unfunded liability. What does JEA need to kind of help you support your bottom line if we're able to partner in these ways? And one idea relates to their pension, because they are part of the general, I point to Joey because he administers that system, but they are part of the general employees pension plan. There might be some benefit in them having separation from that plan. But we think there might be other savings opportunities, revenue opportunities that the city and JEA can partner with, and we hope to have an update for the task force at the next meeting as to the status of those discussions.
So you don't want to be more precise about if they pull out their employees from the GEPP, what in approximate numbers would that result in? If they
Well, we'll be able to report that at the next meeting, and here's why I say that. But the contribution they make each year to the GEPP is how much, Joe? $38 million. So right now they make a $38 million contribution. If JEA had if they had a separate pension plan and had the ability purely to control their pension destiny through the collective bargaining and impasse process, or hopefully an agreement with their unions, we think there are some savings opportunities there. We don't know exactly how much. We have an idea of how much the city was going to save when we negotiated new pension benefits with our general employees unions. But different unions, different approaches. And JEA has taken some approaches that are maybe more suited toward a utility than they are for the city. For example, at their St. John's River Power Park, they have a sort of it's either a hybrid or a cash balance plan. And so they have some more flexibility than the city does in some of these ways. We think there might be some savings opportunities there. In fact, Joey and our city actuary, Jeff Williams from the Siegel Group, is going to be meeting, or at least having a conference call with JEA this week to talk through some of those issues and what the savings might be. So not trying to be evasive, we just don't know exactly what that number would be yet, but we will continue to report back to this task force as to what it might be.
Bob, and then Gwen.
Chris, I mean, if these savings are out there, why wouldn't the city pursue them otherwise, except just in light of this? And if those savings are there, wouldn't those be city general revenue dollars anyways? I mean, it seems to me like we're making some really artificial classifications.
Well, in fact, no, the JEA savings wouldn't be city general revenue dollars. I mean, they make a contribution to the general employees pension plan each year as part of helping it maintain its solvency and to pay for their employees. So, no, in fact, if they were able to save money as a result of an agreement to spin off the JEA pension plan, that would be sort of found money for JEA. That wouldn't impact the general fund at all. Wouldn't impact the general fund now if JEA's employees changed from that, because again, that is a contribution that JEA makes from its budget each year.
Right. Who owns JEA?
City of Jacksonville.
Okay, so in one pocket or another, whatever JEA is worth and whatever they earn is city money. Is that true?
That's true, except for one difference. We have the obligation each year to balance the general fund budget. There are other funds, JEA is one of those, but For us, for those of us who kind of, and people like Councilman Anderson and Councilwoman Boyer and others who have to kind of deal with that city budgeting year after year, the importance of being able to balance that general fund is critical. So you're right, we're all one big city, but for annual budgeting purposes, that general fund budget is extremely important.
So I think, Bob, this helps me so that, let's say it's 30 million. That 30 million contribution doesn't go into the general fund and then gets parceled out. It's a separate contribution.
The JEA contribution to the pension plan? Which contribution?
No, to the city. The annual, that's what you're doing, is increasing the JEA contribution to the general fund.
You are, or, I mean, and I imagine, and this would be a question for legal and finance, there would be a variety of ways you could probably structure that. One option would be to figure out a way to do it so that it goes directly to pay the unfunded liability as opposed to, going into the general fund. But you are correct that through a number of different sources, JEA makes an annual payment that goes into the general fund.
Other questions?
Part of my question's been answered, but if JEA pulls out of the general employees' retirement fund, will there be some consequences there for the general employees' retirement?
Well, and Joey can
Will we
speak
not
to...
be almost back into this kind of situation?
Sure. Joey can speak to this better under, and again, I just want to stress we're really at sort of stage one of the negotiations with them. But, one benefit potentially in allowing JEA to spin off would be that right now the general employees pension fund has an unfunded liability of, give or take $900 million. Under this spin-off option, JEA could also take its unfunded liability with it. That would reduce the general employees' liability to about $450 million. Joey can speak to this. There might be some added administrative costs for the general employees' pension plan going forward if it didn't have JEA as part of it. Joey, do you want to just sort of address that, Ms. Yates' question?
Sure, and just to clarify on the added administrative costs, I don't think we would see any additional dollars in operating the city pension plan, the general employees pension plan, but on a percentage basis, it would go up most likely. If you think about the impact to the taxpayer and the utility payer as a whole, if JEA were to take half of the assets and half of the liabilities, they'd be managing a plan about half the size. And when you manage a plan half the size, right now we're at $2 billion. They would have $1 billion fund. They would have to hire their own actuaries, accountants, attorneys, investment managers. So the fee on a percentage of assets would most likely be a little higher. But as you think about it, if you think about a couple, I know this is going to make it sound like it's not that big of a deal. It is a big deal. But if you think about the added cost of $1 million or $2 million, I'm just throwing numbers out there. I can get you more specifics later on. That extra cost could be far outweighed by any savings that are achievable through retirement reform that JEA may be able to achieve with their employees that we otherwise wouldn't have the opportunity to achieve.
And the last question, in the interest of constituency, in these talks that you're having, are you addressing the fact that JEA may have to increase its rates to be able to cover an additional $40 million?
So I don't think they really have to increase their rate. I think we have an opportunity to forge this partnership, to look at JEA as a partner, as our financial partner. I think it creates a win-win for JEA and for the city in a number of ways. And I think, we'll get you more detail when they continue to have these conversations. But the other thing I want to point out, because something was said earlier, it's just, I think, Bob, you said, it's just one big city, and, the JEA can do things that, on their own. For example, they gave pay raises to their employees. I didn't. I just think we couldn't afford it. But they did it without council approval. They can do that. So there are a number of things that they can do as an independent body. But I think we have an opportunity to really work with them on ways that could save them a lot of money, could save us a lot of money, and create a win-win for, at the end of the day, the hardworking taxpayers. And I think that's what we're trying to do, be innovative and creative and do it in a way that would achieve the goal that we all set out. And that's to really deal with retirement reform now. And I think we have that opportunity. Do you want to add to that, Chris?
Just to sort of reinforce what the mayor said, we don't think that, I know some have suggested that an increased contribution from JEA would mean increased rates. We just don't agree based on what we think some of the savings opportunities and other revenue opportunities might be. And I will say, to JA's credit, in kind of the initial, we've had an initial meeting and then a second meeting where we kind of went into more detail. They didn't immediately wave the higher rates flag. I mean, that's not something they immediately went to. They expressed a willingness to have an exchange and a back and forth with us to see if we, see if we could make progress on this. So, we don't believe that this automatically responds with higher rates here. We think there's a chance to achieve that balance.
Yeah, the other thing I want to make very clear is when people say general fund, resources, new revenue, this will be 100% going toward retirement reform, unfunded liability, 100%. So, Mr. Chairman, to your point, if it's 40 million, if it's whatever it is, it's going to 100% to unfunded liability. I mean, I think that's very, very important to state.
You already raised it. Carl, then Ted.
No, our first charge is police and fire. But assuming that this plan that you have works perfectly, and it, just like it shows.
I like the way you think, Carl.
Will that potentially lead to maybe some answers for the general pension fund as well? Because there's a secondary concern. We had talked about, we should be concerned about that as well.
Well, I'll tell you, I've heard, some discussion out in the community about, well, when you just talk about the police and fire pension fund unfunded liability, you're ignoring this whole additional unfunded liability. This is not a situation where unfunded liabilities are created equally. Joey can sort of expound upon this a little bit, but kind of less in the public eye because a lot of the focus has understandably been on the police and fire pension side. We negotiated new benefits for 2 of our 4 general employees unions, and I think we're fairly close to agreement on the other 2. They're in the impasse process for other reasons. One of the things you see through those negotiations is that in a fairly short period of time, just through the change in benefit design, we substantially reduce the unfunded liability. Joey, you might want to expound upon that a little bit, just generally speaking, how that is, and Joey manages the general employees pension.
The reforms that we achieved, or that we tentatively had agreed to with 2 out of the 4 general employees retirement unions, were pretty significant. We brought the normal cost. If you think about the various aspects that lead to the 110% or 111% of payroll that we're putting in for police and fire, that number with general employees is currently 29%, and that's probably why you're seeing it not receiving as much attention. As a percentage of payroll, it's a much lower amount. Doesn't mean it's not an issue. It's still projected to increase over time with nothing being changed. But with the reforms that we have on the table, and like Chris said, we may achieve with the other 2 unions as well, so we'll have all 4, we bring the normal cost of the fund down to a cost very comparable to Social Security. And if you look out far enough into the projection, it's lower than Social Security. So we feel like we've achieved a pretty substantial level there. And we've heard from various stakeholders that right now the focus is and should be on the biggest issue that we're facing. And then after that, potentially we hammer that home as well on the general employee side. But I am hopeful because what we have achieved so far looks very good on the general employee side.
And we'll be happy to sort of share to the extent we can, given some of the collective bargaining rules, some of those projections for general employees, because I think that will help you see that, again, it's not one giant unfunded liability. There are 2 separate unfunded liabilities, and they are very different. The character of the police and fire pension fund unfunded liability is very different from the general employees, and the ways in which we need to respond to deal with it are very different. And we can show you some of those general employee projections if that would be helpful.
Yes. My first response was this 24 million, we're dipping into the reserves again. That's been the problem. But I had to step back a little bit and say, realize, we here on the committee, we're sitting here saying, we want everything today. We want to get rid of the liability today. That's not realistic politically. And I realize that, and I think most of us realize that. And frankly, from what I'm seeing, a lot of what I'm seeing, I think this is a very creative approach, and I commend you for coming up with a comprehensive approach that looks like it has a lot of potential for doing this. And I think that perhaps we need to start looking this a little bit further to evaluate it. But I do have a couple of questions. When you're not talking, I know you were talking about using the JEA funds and the chapter benefits to pay down the unfunded liability. You're not talking about ever using those to pay the annual required contribution, are you?
Correct. They would be purely for unfunded liability paydown.
Okay. And I understand, I mean, I hate the idea of using the reserve funds in the first few years, but if it's part of a comprehensive plan that's designed to cushion the blow going forward, I think that makes sense if it's a part of the plan. I'm wondering, though, I still believe that the chapter benefits monies can't be used for anything but enhanced benefits. And frankly, I know that Jim Lynn gave the different opinion. I think he's wrong. I think there's a lot of people who are, there's some lawsuits that are about to be filed around the state based on that belief, too, that he's wrong, and that's not the right. So what I would hope is to avoid some of those things, because I think this is a comprehensive plan. Maybe putting modifying the 30-year agreement to get some agreements on these issues to use those funds, may be a way to avoid some of those issues in terms of how you can use this. And if that's the case, would you also, if there is going to be a modification of that 30-year agreement, which is what the task force is recommending, would you be willing to put in a modification of the 30-year agreement that the JEA funds and the chapter benefits will not be used to pay the annual required contribution?
Well, I would say this, and we're open to a variety of different approaches. This is one where we definitely need legal guidance to sort of figure out from our general counsel and from Mr. Lynn. Speaking of Mr. Lynn, just to defend his honor.
No, I understand. Yeah. He has a different opinion, and he may be wrong.
Well, and just to recall, his opinion is based on 3 words in Chapter 175 and 185, which is deemed to comply. Our Police and Fire Pension Fund is deemed to comply with those chapters. Others around the state don't have that same protection, but we'll have that debate at a different time. But the answer is we're open to a number of approaches, subject to the legal guidance that we've got to get from our attorneys as to what's allowed under the charter and the ordinance code. I will tell you, and the mayor has been extremely strong and adamant about this, is that this supplemental payment that we're getting from JEA and might be using from the half of the chapter funds, that has to go down to pay the unfunded liability. Open to different approaches as to how that would work as part of the agreement based on the advice of legal counsel.
And remember that.
I think part of it is too, I just want to make one point on these funds, because I think people are cynical of government, and they should be. The investment should be for the unfunded liability. That's non-negotiable. Shouldn't be for anything else. It's just non-negotiable. I'm very adamant about it, and I've been firm on this. If we're going to do this, we got to do it once and for all. And the way to do that is if we get $40 million from JEA, it should go to the unfunded liability. Same thing with the chapter funds. And I think it will restore confidence in the market. It will restore confidence in the city. And I think it will give us certainty in the marketplace, certainty with city employees, certainty with stakeholders that they know this is what it's going for versus, we may be able to use it for this in future years. I just think that has to be, and I know, Mr. Chairman, I'm not trying to tell the board what to do, but I'm just giving you my position on this because I think we're going to have this opportunity to really solve our challenges, and this is one way to do that, to ensure that the funds go nowhere else, even in an emergency, because in an emergency we can always deal with issues. But in this case, I think we should be clear about it.
Well, picking up on what Carl said last time, he said it again today, as one citizen, it just seems to me we've got a whole your feet to the fire and your successor's feet to the fire, and Council President and Councilman Anderson's feet to the fire. So, Ted, as far as I'm concerned, it would need to be in either an amendment to the 30-year agreement, a new agreement, or something that binds the future. I think that's what Carl said. I think that is a strong feeling on behalf of this committee. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One other observation is this. This plan, the way that the administration is pushing, is portraying this would actually be a reduction by $130 million a year. That is ultimately a political decision for the council and the mayor to work out. If they decide that, no, they don't want to save the $130 million a year, and instead they want to put it towards unfunded liability, perhaps our role here is to come up with a good plan that gives them that leeway, and if they do want to do additional work to pay off the unfunded liability quicker, then that may be up to the council.
Sure. John?
Okay. Two topics, one on JEA. First of all, applaud the creativity. I think that's great. I guess I'm asking, is there another arrow in the quiver relative to rates? Do you view that as more acceptable as a means for, if his 40 million is the right number, okay, and all the other things, all the other partnership don't get us there, are rates more acceptable than taxes as a means for addressing that issue?
Well, I think the answer is we don't believe that because we do think there are partnership. I'm not going to assume the counterfactual, because we do believe there are partnership opportunities. We don't think that a rate increase is going to be necessary to form these partnerships. We think there's a way to support JEA's bottom line to the extent that they could make this contribution without having a rate increase. I mean, it's a very large, as you know, very large, well-budgeted organization. And we believe that we can work out these partnerships. So we don't see a rate increase as being necessary here.
Okay, second topic has to do with the costs associated with the current employees, I guess, restoration of the cuts, and how was that factored into the numbers that we're looking at?
Sure. I'll let our actuary speak to that. But before I bring up Robert, I just wanted to address one quick point that Tad raised, which is about using the $24 million. Tad, one thing I would tell you is we think there could still be other opportunities for unfunded liability pay down, separate and apart from what's in this agreement. I'll give you a good example. The mayor, at the last time he spoke to the task force, he talked about the possibility of selling city property and using some of those proceeds. We did not include that here, only because our asset optimization study is ongoing. We don't want to prejudice that study. We want it to finish and come up with some recommendations on how to deal with city property. But there still are opportunities for what amount to kind of one-time investments out of that process to help pay down the unfunded liability. So
one thing too, I noticed you changed the COLA, and it's going to be less attractive to employees. I mean, that is probably going to result in a savings as well. And I don't know if you factored that in terms of that savings, but that's a little harder to anticipate. But it's because it's not an immediate, but it will result in probably fewer employees opting for COLA.
Well, and that's a great segue back to Mr. Wilbank's point.
Yeah.
Robert, do you want to answer sort of the impact of those changes for current employees, the increase in the contribution, the change to drop in COLA, how that factored in?
Robert Tazubi. The basis for our projections was the 2012 valuation done by the police and fire actuary. His assumptions include that salaries will increase 4% a year. When we did our projections, we continue that assumption. So we're saying from 10/1/12, salaries are going to go up 4% a year for individual police and fire members. We built into that as of 10/1/14, for current police and fire, the employee contributions would increase from 7% to 8%. And I may be off the year, either FY fiscal year 15 and 16 or 16 and 17, we assume current employee contributions would go from 8% to 9%, and then from 9% to 10%. So we did factor all that in. If salaries actually from 10/1/12 to 9/30/13 have actually gone up less than 4%, there will be some associated savings just because projected benefits will be less. And then the answer to your COLA is when we do evaluation, we take each person and project him out to when he's going to retire, quit, go into drop, and then we have him getting benefits based on essentially his life expectancy. We have those benefits going up with COLA, and what we did here is we bifurcated the benefit, so the benefit earned through, I believe it was September 14, would get the full 3% COLA. Under the projections, the benefit earned after that date would only get the 1.5% COLA. So that is all built into our liabilities.
The cost of the COLA, but not the likelihood of somebody electing the drop. You didn't factor that in. That'd be very hard to factor.
Oh, I thought you were asking about the COLA, the drop.
Yeah, but because you're reducing the COLA, you're going to make somebody less likely in their drop, and there's going to be an associated cost savings.
Yeah, when I talked at one of these previous meetings, I said there's a lot of things that affect whether or not an employee retiring is going to elect drop. It's also COLA, it's salary, it's the years of service. There's just a lot of things built into it. So there could be even more savings if less people go into the current drop program, although you're saying COLA, and I'm thinking of the guarantee as the guarantee is reduced from 8.4.
I'm thinking the rate on
Yeah, that definitely will make it a little bit less attractive, but still compared to a current savings account, which I think, if you have money in the bank, you're earning 0.5%. If you're lucky, even market rate of returns between 0 and 10% are probably going to be better than what a bank is going to offer you.
Other questions? Kirsten?
I wanted to ask about enhanced benefits. That the fund uses half of its chapter funds to pay for base and then half for enhanced. What are those?
Joey, who's the fund treasurer, might be able to speak to more of that. Joey, do you have some specifics on what those are?
As was alluded to earlier in the discussion, the chapter funds amount to about $9 million per year, and that's been relatively stable over time. Half of that, $4.5 million, is currently being put into an enhanced benefit account. Those records are maintained, at the police and fire pension fund. The assets are invested. The other half is going to reduce the contribution that the employer has to make into the fund. So it's about $4.5 million per side. And under the presentation today, what we would be asking the police and fire pension fund to do in return for the give on this side would be to take the other $4.5 million, and instead of putting it into a reserve account for enhanced benefits down the road, use that to, in this case, pay down the unfunded liability.
Okay, so it has not, can I just follow up on that? So it has nothing, it doesn't have any present day, it's not paying for any present day benefits that are being offered.
Each year, at the end of the year, there is a bonus that's paid to retirees. Just in December, so just a couple months ago, there was a bonus paid to retirees out of that money. And there's currently a balance of $24 million roughly in the account right now.
I guess, have you finished?
Yeah, and I can follow up.
Okay. Okay, Gwen? Y'all remember to put your microphone so people can hear?
Point of clarification, those enhanced benefits can be used to reduce the liability. The portion that's not being used presently, they can legally use those dollars for other things.
According to our legal counsel, and he may want to speak to this directly since he's here, but due to the deemed to comply language of chapters 175 and 185, because our plan is deemed to comply, yes, we believe that that would be the case, and there's been opinions related to another deemed to comply jurisdiction, which is Miami, that may affect this. Jim, do you want to speak to this?
Under the existing agreement, under the existing 30-year agreement, as codified in the pension plan, the chapter monies every year are allocated the way that Mr. Greavy just described. $4.5 million go to essentially get set aside. 4.5 million are used to pay down, offset the city's required contribution. So the 4.5 million that gets set aside is now grown to 24 million. That's set aside. I think that there would be no issue at all. I mean, as someone else has mentioned, that's part of the existing agreement. That would need to be renegotiated, but those monies could be legally used if the agreement were renegotiated to be reallocated to pay down unfunded liabilities. And there's plenty of examples around the state of that happening.
Yep.
I just have a final request
Take
of
your
the
time.
mayor and Chris. You know, as a former council person representing a constituency that could ill afford rates from JEA, I ask you, as you are discussing that, please remember the folks out there who would be impacted by additional rate increase. And I've just sort of heard, the reason why I'm sticking on that is because I've just sort of heard that if JEA is going to help us out, that a rate increase may be on the line. So just please keep
Sure,
that in mind.
and I really appreciate your focus on that. I mean, it goes back to why I was against raising property taxes. It goes to the point why I don't support the gas tax. Everybody's pushing taxes right now. Gas tax, library tax, bond taxing for schools. We're going to be taxed out, and it goes to the very heart of the people you're talking about. So I think the key is, can we forge this partnership to make sure we protect hardworking taxpayers' dollars? Can we form this partnership to really once and for all focus on unfunded liability and resolve retirement reform? And that's our focus. So, I think we can do that. And I think with all of us working together and with your support, I think there's a way to do it because we do know there are people who are still challenged financially, economically. It's tough out here. We see it every day. So our goal is to make sure that we do it in a way that's fair to taxpayers, fair to city employees, fair to our first responders. When they go out every day, when police and fire go out every day, they're putting themselves on the line, their life's on the line, and they're not thinking about a pension. They're not thinking about, the first thing they're thinking about is going in and saving someone, focusing on safety and security. And so we have an obligation to provide that same security for them. God forbid something to happen to them, and then the family needs to be taken care of. So and I, from one, very sensitive about these issues when it comes to taxes and rate increases, and I think I've made myself very clear on those issues. I don't think we have to do it. I just believe that, and I believe we have an opportunity to get it done. So thank you for your emphasis and stressing your concerns, Councilwoman Yates. I really appreciate it.
A question on the design. The new employees' final average compensation is going to be based on the last 60 months instead of the last 24 months. To me, that seemed like, is that going to change? Because y'all don't address that, but I may be cynical that salaries somehow rise a lot more in the last 2 years for some strange reason. Did y'all consider spreading that for existing employees to the?
We did not, and Robert, we considered a lot of options. That is not one we included here, mainly because, and Robert, correct me if I'm wrong, that is not a major, in terms of the different elements, that is not one of the major cost drivers of our annual pension contribution. So that's when we didn't, we focused on the three we did because of their potential impact on annual costs.
But even if it's not from a taxpayer's perspective, it seems to me that makes sense over the course of it, at least from not just aesthetics, but it just helps reduce the belief that people are gaming the system. Robert, you want to?
One comment I was going to have is the police and fire system does not include overtime and compensation And that's usually when you read about all the bad stories about people inflating their salaries in the last year or the last 2 years, is because they're working tons of overtime to getting really higher salaries that they're going to get higher benefits that really haven't been paid for. And the police and fire fund does not include overtime, so you don't have the problem with that.
And the other thing, there's no cap of the 99,999 on the existing.
There's a cap for new employees, not for current employees.
Mr. Chairman, the one thing I'd say about the 2 years versus the 5 years is, I know there's still a lot of promotions that happen late in a career for law enforcement, and I think that'd be a disincentive for a senior employee to take a promotion if you didn't let him include that in his pension benefit.
You would include it, but it'd just be averaged out.
It'd be averaged out, so it'd be a disincentive, and there's actually a lot of late promotions, which is pretty healthy for police, I know.
It might be an incentive to work longer at the higher position.
What now?
It may be an incentive to work longer
That's
at
right.
the higher level position, which is good for the city.
That's right. Kirsten, then Gwen. Oh, David hadn't asked anything. Let's take David.
Just to triangulate a little bit around all the numbers. So when we were working with David last time, and we said, what's a level benefit payment that would be required to fund the plan along this, about the same time frame, we came up with $190 million, right? So Bill, you helped us understand that if you add all the pieces together, this gets us to 180, so same ballpark as the 190. There were different assumptions being made as to what benefits are, and so we've got a mixed bag that Pew used, and we have a different version, and thank you for the leadership on how we might get to some specific changes to make things happen. Is there enough visibility between these estimates and what Pew did to understand that this is the same set of assumptions but a slightly tighter benefit that was assumed for purposes of a blue sky analysis by Pew? Is that what's driving the lower?
I'll let David and Jonathan address that, but I believe they operated off of the exact same assumptions that we did since they were working with Robert and some of his modeling, but I'll let them address it.
And before David comes to the phone, they had, Chris had talked with him yesterday, so I wanted David, Drain, and Jonathan to explain what they viewed of this particular proposal too. So yeah, that was the next on the list.
Okay.
Right. That was, David?
Are you ready to take this presentation now?
Yeah.
Well, so just a couple other clarifications then. So if the 180 and the 190 are roughly comparable, we'll get the details on that later. You know, I think this, as I understand it, the two big things that are coming out of this are, we said, the subcommittee said, we don't know what we're going to make. We think we're going to make 7% as a midpoint. If we want to go with a higher level of confidence, we might make 5.4% to get 75% assurance. And so the subcommittee's view was, if you go at that rate, then the 190 or the 180 here starts to become close to 210 or 220, right? And so I think the first part of the ask is, with all respect, you're saying burdening the city to come up with 210 or 220 in order to have a greater confidence that we can make this work is just pushing too hard against what's feasible. Is that one ask that's coming out of this request?
I think so. Yeah, I think as the mayor said, and just sort of repeating comments that were made at the last meeting, that we need to have some balance. The goal is, and one thing the task force has repeatedly emphasized are the concepts of sustainability and discipline. The proposal that the mayor has made today is made with the aim in mind of making sure the city can sustain these contributions over time and be disciplined about making them.
Right.
If you lose that balance, we think sustainability and discipline become much harder to maintain over time.
Right. So to that point, rather than going from 140 to 400, we start out at 180. So we're pre-funding more than what otherwise required, but we're doing so at a level where the 7% is a requirement for this plan to work. That's the proposal that this represents. Okay, the second question is on the, I'm just trying to make sure I understand the JEA point. So to the extent the city was committing to make $180 million of contributions, the proposal that says, well, 40 of that's going to come from a JEA distribution?
Correct.
What are the legal rights and responsibilities of the parties that arise by having that JEA methodology versus the city saying, I've got the 180, I'm going to cover it, and I'll go to JEA? Is it because you're going to ask JEA to contractually enter into commitments that wouldn't be there otherwise? Is that
Well, we currently have a contractual agreement with JEA that's identified in the charter as to how much they make in contributions each year. That agreement is coming due in the next, I think, next 2 years. I think it expires in 16. So this is a good time to revisit that agreement and potentially use it for the benefit of these unfunded liability issues. So there is an agreement between the city and JEA as to the annual contribution. We would be seeking to modify that agreement for the benefit of these pension issues.
So essentially, this is the city saying, we'll commit to 180, but we're going to give you transparency as to where it's going to come from.
Correct. I mean, that would be the point of having, having JEA participate, and there is a contractual framework for which to do that.
And to that point, from a contractual level, I heard them saying, well, we may have the JEA contract to do it. It's really the city's money, and so the city would then enter into an agreement with the JPFPF to fund that at that level.
At the 180.
At the 180 level. I meant to say this before, and that is an incentive to the JPFPF to concede some of the governance structures that we've asked in return. And that's all to be negotiated. They also, it's not just the task force that wants to hold people's feet to the fire. From the JPFPF's perspective, the city hadn't lived up to its agreements in the past, so they want, and that's one reason that Judge Schlesinger is in there.
Well, and to that point, to reinforce, Mr. Chairman, what you're saying, I think that's why all these pieces have to fit together. If the city's going to make an additional, through an arrangement with JEA, let's say an additional $40 million a year, that obviously heightens the importance of some new kind of governance rules, regulations, guidelines at the Police and Fire Pension Fund. Because if we're going to, over a period of time, over a 14-year period, that's $560 million. If we're going to invest that kind of money through a contract with JEA, that makes the governance piece of what the task force is doing all the more important, because we want to make sure if we're investing that money, we're going to get the highest possible return. There's going to be the greatest transparency and accountability at the Police and Fire Pension Fund.
One last small detail. So that we had a new term that was introduced today, which is the uncombined amortization. That's consistent with the 30 years for every layer, right? That was.
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Thank you. Gwen was next.
Now, I just want to go on record as saying I am not opposed to what you've presented. I just think that we need to take the time to look through it and then make sure that where it maybe needs a little tweaking, that we have an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, all in favor of the same, to say now. Kirsten.
I think it would be helpful if we could get, and I don't know if this is something that David can help us with, but in our last meeting, we've been provided this analysis that shows sort of retirement wealth accrual and really the meaningful impact on employees of these various plans. And the mediated settlement agreement was in that, but I don't know that we have some sort of visual comparison of what this new enhanced plan does. I think that would be helpful. Or if it doesn't really change it in a meaningful way, tell me that's fine. But with respect to that, I am interested in having a little bit more information on the value that these cuts have. Do they reduce the city's annual payment? Do they bring down the unfunded liability? Or is this just a way to give it to the employee a little bit more so they share the pain? Because I think it's important that if we're cutting things, that there's a principled reason and we know the value of that and where that falls out with respect to the city's commitment.
Well, Kirsten, first of all, I can assure you no one here is attempting to give it to the employee, as you say. We're trying to establish a sustainable pension system so that they, have secure retirements. But we can absolutely put a value on particularly the current employees' changes. The contribution, for example, increase, that's fairly easy to determine. At last check, a 3% contribution increase amounts, I believe, to between $5 and $6 million a year, but we can determine that precisely and get all of those for you.
Is your sense, though, that the changes, because it doesn't seem like these are massive or drastic changes from the initial mediated settlement agreement? Is your sense that it doesn't really change the value of the plan to employees that drastically from the mediated plan?
We think these are changes, again, as the mayor said in his remarks, the goal here was balance. We think these are changes that help with the pension challenges that we have, and that sort of address community concerns about some of those pension challenges, but don't so fundamentally alter the structure of the pension plan that no one wants to come work in Jacksonville.
Yeah, let me say this, and I think that's the key, right? We want to be fair and competitive. We want to be able to make sure that Sheriff John Rutherford and Marty Senefit will have the ability to recruit and retain the best and the brightest. And we want to be fair to the first responders. There's no question about it. And I think the first responders also want to live in a good city, and a city that has a great quality of life. So that's why we want to be fair. We want to be competitive in the marketplace. And I think that's important. We don't want to lose, I mean, everybody's entitled to their remarks, Mr. Chairman, but earlier about all of these well-talented people leaving our city and going to another city. There's no other city better than Jacksonville. I don't think first responders get hired, these young men and women come to the city for a pension. I don't think they think about that. I think they think about doing their duty. The same way men and women sign up to serve our country with distinction in the military. They go to serve their country. I don't think they're thinking about a paycheck, although they need it to survive. I don't think they're thinking about pension. I think they do it because it's a noble and right thing to do. Having said that, as mayor of the city, I'm going to make sure for those who are willing to join public service and bypass the private sector to come into city government to serve their city, we should have a retirement reform system that would be attractive to them, that will allow us to keep our intellectual capital here and recruit and retain the best and the brightest. That's what we want to do. And that's why we've taken so much time. That's why we listen to your concerns. That's why we've listened to what the Civic Council have said and what the Chamber has said. And we're listening and we're taking all this in. So it's important. I mean, this is a really tough issue. There are no silver bullets. But I think with working with our partners, we can get this done. I want to be clear about that because, I think with everyone working on this issue, we're trying to make sure that we have a balanced approach to solve this problem.
Thanks. Carl?
Over time, bond ratings change, city bond ratings, and I'm assuming ours is probably in the last 5 years is probably weakened. Is that accurate? Or potentially weakened?
If you remember back just a few months ago, Fitch came out and put us on negative watch. Like was alluded to earlier, Moody's has now come out and said, we've been talking to you guys for years. This is the way I interpret it because I talk to them every time we do a bond deal. We've been warning you for years that if you don't do something about your pension problems today, we are going to have to take action. The memo that was released on the 15th, just last week, put that in a very public light. And said, you are on that list.
That leads to my next question. 5 years, 7 years, 10 years from now, we have shown that we are aggressively changed that situation. We should expect our bond ratings to go up.
Absolutely.
Which should lead to long-term savings for the city. Pretty substantial savings, probably in the millions. I'm talking about over this same period of time, just our fixing this problem could be huge.
I agree with that. I mean, I go up, Ronnie and Joey and Glenn and I, we go up, we meet with the rating agencies. I've been up there making our case. And I got to tell you something. If you think about the first plan we introduced, the Fitch rating agencies endorsed our first pension plan. They said it would stabilize the city finances. It was the right plan. This is not Alvin Brown. These are the folks who said, you know what, this works. Why? Because we balanced 3 budgets. and we've had some major deficits, and we balance them without raising taxes and tapping into the city reserve. We streamlined government to be more effective and efficient. We've taken a comprehensive approach to streamline city government so that when they're looking at the city, we refinance over $1 billion in debt. So we're doing all the right things, to your point, Carl. So now this is the last issue that we're dealing with, and I take great pride in the stride we made to saving taxpayers' dollars, not wasting it, making sure that we protect their hardworking assets. And I got to tell you something, as a team, we've done a great job, and they realize that. But now, as I said in my remarks today, we're one of 256 cities, okay? We don't want to be on that list. The time is now. There's a sense, fierce of urgency here.
We understand we understand.
And I want to make this last comment, Mr. Chairman. I want people to really take a step back after today and think about it. I mean, literally, if we do what we have to do and get it done, we can get this resolved sooner rather than later. So I want to thank you for your time, but I'm focused like a laser on this. You know, it's just, it's so important for our city.
I'd like David Drain to come up and just, Pew's talked about this with them, and just, David, give us what insights you can share.
Well, let me start off by answering the two questions from David and Kirsten, and then just give some general comments on what we heard today. So, you know, really the difference between what we modeled previously and what we see in this proposal are one, the COLA changes, two, you know, the use of JEA funds, which are above and beyond the city contributions reported. And then three, it pays it off over a slightly longer time frame based on this, you know, separate amortization bases. So those are the differences. I think we should be able to incorporate this into, you know, a set of exhibits looking at different funding approaches. To look at the benefit side, so for new workers, the mediated settlement agreement plan is kept intact. So all the analyses we showed on that, you know, are going to be retained. For current employees, you know, what are the differences? Well, one, there's the changes to drop. You know, I'm not sure exactly how much impact there will be, but you know, that's going to be one piece. Two, there's going to be a 1 percentage point increase in employee contributions, and obviously that's going to be, you know, less money that current employees will be able to take home. But the biggest impact is going to be in the COLAs and the changes there. And if you're an employee at the very end of your career, if you've got 20, 25 years of service under the current plan, you know, you're largely going to be unaffected. You're eligible for the drop, so you're not going to have any changes to drop. You've accrued all the benefits you're going to accrue, so your COLAs are going to be the exact 3% that you're expecting. And you're not going to have a large number of years of paying at that increased employee contribution. If you're at the very beginning of your career, you know, suddenly your COLA has been reduced substantially, and that's a major cut, and you're going to be paying, you know, an additional 3 percentage points over your full career, and so you will see differences that a current employee will get in benefits. Yeah. And I think that's something we should, you know, I don't want to make promises on behalf of our actuary until we've thought about this, but I think that's something we can try looking at and give some insight on. In terms of what these proposals do writ large, you know, there's three questions that the task force is trying to wrestle with. How do you improve governance? How do you deal with funding the unfunded? And how do you design benefits going forward? On the governance piece, you know, as I think the mayor and Chris said, you know, this is an ongoing conversation that Chairman Shai has been leading, and that, you know, various parties have been giving input on. And having a set of smart governance improvements is really an important task of this task force, and something that I think we're seeing is well on its way. On the plan design piece, you know, for new employees, it's you know, something like you've seen already, and then on current employees, it's asking them to bear more sacrifice than some of the original proposals. So then really brings us to the funding question, and, you know, does this work in terms of funding? And really our baseline was, you know, what's good funding policy for Jacksonville? One, you know, we think it's meritorious to go above and beyond the arc. When you're 39% funded, you know, you want to help give the plan a buffer against future downturns. You want to put more money in than simply the minimum. This plan does that. it's also good to try to avoid that steep cliff that we saw, and that's something that the task force has been very emphatic was, made sense for Jacksonville. It's something that, makes sense from a pension funding perspective, and so, once again, it achieves that. And 3, it's going to pay down. It's going to take a little longer than that 23-year period under the status quo to pay down the unfunded liability, but it builds a buffer sooner, and it pays it in less than 30 years, which is the standard best practice. So, there still remain questions for the task force on, is it right to take money, have money come from JA or from another source? How do you balance, pressures on spending versus, the impact of raising revenue in different ways? But, that's the real remaining question of funding. But in terms of, does this fund the pension plan? Does this help deal with PFPF's unfunded liability in a reasonable, sustainable way? From our perspective, it does. And kind of the 3 pieces that maybe there, is room to look at this proposal and to think further about. So one, I think from what I hear from the task force's questions, it may be helpful to have more details about, what that JEA proposal looks like, and just have a better sense of, look, it's either going to come from savings and efficiencies, or it's going to come from, raising rates. I think ideally for, voters and citizens of Jacksonville, it would be better if savings and efficiencies are where it comes from, but, maybe rate increases are part of it. 2 is, how do you make sure that in future administrations, that JA money still goes into the pension fund, is still paying down the unfunded liability rather than being used for other purposes or being used to defray the ARC. And finding a smart legal way to do that is obviously an important, finishing detail. And then, finally thinking hard about, when this plan is fully funded, and, whether it's in, 28 years or 23 years or however long it takes, going forward, how we're going to be allocating chapter funds, how we're going to be making sure that they're, when times are good, that they're available to help enhance benefits.
Thank you. Question, Sherry?
Thank you, David. I want to make sure I heard this correctly. So if this entire, I'll call it comprehensive plan, were achieved, back to the JEA piece, basically we're looking for $40 million in revenue. We're not looking for 90.
I mean,
so at the very beginning of this, when I joined this task force, Bill's figure was $90 million. If all of this happened, that figure is $40 million, regardless of the source. Just boiling it down to how much money do we need annually going forward. If the fund agreed to all the benefit changes, et cetera, that's the bottom line in terms of the amount of money we're looking for annually.
When those original discussions were happening, it started off with what's affordable from the general fund, and so it was $120 million plus $90 million from a hypothetical $2 million property tax increase, and that got us to this original figure. Now, what they're proposing is, what the city is modeling out is, rather than $120 million from the general fund, it's $136, $140 million, plus $40 million from JAA, plus an additional $4.5 million from chapter funds. So, one, it's asking more to come from the general fund, and once again, it's balancing spending versus
not more than what came from the general fund this year.
Exactly. So it's when it was in both cases, it's asking less from the general funds to pay these costs. It's proposing less in additional revenue coming in part because it's asking more from current employees, the COLA changes, and then secondly, it's spreading these costs out over a longer period. And so both of those give the city some additional room to put in less in those initial years.
Yeah, the number is between 180 and 190, and we were using 120 base. And just looking at this, they're starting at 136, it goes to 140. They get to 120 in fiscal year 29. So, but the gross number is somewhere between 180 and 190. John?
It's really a question for David. I'm a little bit unclear on the reserve fund has come out of the enhanced benefits in terms of 24 million. In terms of, it would be fair to ask for the fund to give their position relative to that as a part of, again, another means by which we could reduce the unfunded liability.
Sure. Yeah, I would think we would want John's comments. I don't know if he wants, he might want to reflect upon it.
Right.
Do it next meeting, or if you want to say anything now, you're certainly welcome to.
I think I'll study it when they talk to the next meeting.
Chris, I would really appreciate a model that averages the last 5 years rather than the 24.
As part of current employees.
Current employees as well. Right. I mean, I realize that may be, but I think it does have a lot of.
Bill,
Carl?
I got a question for Greg. Is the council obligated to a certain general fund number out of its budget?
For the pension contribution, it's whatever the actuarial valuation indicates that we have to. This past year was 148.
This year it wound up being the
148.
40.
148 for the police and fire pension fund only.
Bob?
To put the $40 million in perspective, Chris, what's the annual contribution to the city general fund from JEA today and in recent years?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Just make sure I get it right. This is simply the contribution, not any money derived from public service tax or franchise fees. Glenn, what's the amount? $110 million currently.
So this is a 35% increase.
This would move it up to $150 million, with that 40 going to the unfunded liability.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty significant increase.
Do you know what their total revenues are?
I don't. Joey or someone else, do you know what the, I don't have, we can certainly get that for you, but I don't have it at my fingertips.
Wonder what percentage it is.
Other questions?
I had a question.
Okay. Before I forget about it, Cindy, you had promised us last time you would get us one sheet that had all of the investment authority, including what was in the bill, and I forgot
sorry,
about it.
I hadn't read.
You probably did too. But we need that to go into our recommendations,
Okay.
if that's where we are.
I'll see if it's ready. I can email while I'm here.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. So it's not bifurcated. It's one list.
Right, you wanted the existing one redlined to add the new ones.
So we could
And-
see in
right.
one place what all.
Yes, I might be able to get it brought down in just a couple of
Right,
minutes.
sorry.
Let me check.
David, are you presenting slides today?
No.
I think, we've had outstanding requests for some slides that I think go a long way to helping us figure out a little bit some of these questions. So you did a great job of helping us understand there's sort of three things here. One's the governance. The second one is how you think of benefit cost. And we had a good question from Kristen about, well, how do we place a value judgment on these changes and what do we think about it? And the subcommittees and Pew's views were that, hey, the right way to sort of distill this down is to look at normal cost. So I think another way to ask that is existing employees as one population and new employees as one population under the existing proposals for the MSP had a certain normal cost, and that was paid from several sources. Some of it was paid by the employee, some of it was paid by chapter funds, and some of it through its various avenues was paid by the city. So how does that compare with where we were before? And maybe this is a Robert DeZubi question, with where we're proposing to go now. And I think this has done a good job of saying, a lot of folks have said, it'd be nice if we could get a little bit tighter kind of a benefit structure in existing employees. And so that would define, well, how much have we done that in terms of a cost as a percentage of payroll? And so I think we need those normal costs across these proposals, and hey, that helps us put perspective as to where we are and what we're proposing. And then that against other external benchmarks would give us a value judgment as to, well, do we like having a pension plan that costs 15% or 10% or what it is? I think this first request. Second request, I think, is you were going to help us with some slides that would say, well, let's just understand what kind of a pot we get into here if we adopt a funding strategy that may not be as much as we would like to do if we had a perfect world, right? So if we start down this approach that says, we know we may not make 7%, but that's realistic, but we may not make 7%. So if we start off at this level, and then at some point in our future, you know, the next 5 years are bad in the markets. At some point in our future, we're going to say, you know what, we got a problem again, right? And so at that point, we're going to be facing a level payment that's not going to be $180 million a year. It's going to be some bigger number. And so I think you were helping us with slides that would say, if you assume 7, but 5.4 is what you get, what kind of a difficulty have you got into, and what would it take to get out of it? And I think that actually comes into bearing as we try to take a value judgment. Do we want to take funding risk or not take funding risk? And I think we just don't have the resources to do that without help, and I think it could be a real value if either you or Mr. DeZubi would take that on. So.
On the second one, I think, you know, we're in the process of putting final slides together. I think one of our goals would be to add in the city proposal, the mayor's proposal to that, to show how they compare both under a 7% scenario and a 5.4. On the former question, so what are the 3 changes again? It's the drop changes, it's the employee contribution changes, and it's the COLA changes for currents. I think coming up with I think, you know, and Robert Zume may be able to give an answer on that, but it is hard to, you know, the change is really impactful on on a relatively new employee, someone in their first and second year. It's relatively minor on someone on their, you know, last year or last, penultimate year. And so coming up with a normal cost answer to that may be difficult. And, you know, so I think it would be useful for us to be able to quantify in some way how much those COLA changes save. It may not be expressed in terms of normal costs.
Or maybe just be for new employees, and we would have to recognize that, hey, there's a negotiation in place with existing employees, and some of this is figuring out how you make it work. But I think at least for new employees, having a normal cost would be it.
David, can you do that?
Let me talk to our actuary and talk to Robert before I commit anything on the latter.
But just like y'all feel free to talk with each other directly.
We have.
And you have.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I know there were a couple of questions. One was the revenue from JEA, which in 2012, I believe, was $1.9 billion. And also, I don't think it's a major increase. I see it as a great opportunity for them to get a return on their investment, because as we laid out, you know, they have employees in their pension plan that, you know, again, I think by forging the right partnership will save all of us in both ways. And so I look at it kind of differently. And I think whatever chart, Zuby, or whatever we need, I want to get it to them, because I want to make sure that, you know, people have confidence in what was presented. Because what I want to avoid, Mr. Chairman, is, you know, Monday morning quarterback, right? So whatever you need, ask now. I want to avoid what happened the first time from the Civic Council and the Chamber. I just want to make sure whatever you need, because I really want to get this done and finish up as soon as possible.
Bill?
Yeah, Chris, I think you made it clear early on that you've got some more detail to bring back on this $40 million, because I think most of us understood the 90 and a 2 mil increase, and I'm seeing where parts of this come, but the 40 still feels a little bit like magic money with a 35% increase in what's already coming from the city. So I'm not saying it is right now, I'm just saying that that's the request, as you come back to just give us some more detail on exactly how that comes about.
We'll have a report for you, sort of a follow-up report on January 29th.
And would you be good enough to ask Paul McElroy to come to our meeting too?
Sure, be happy to.
He's the head of the JIC. Yeah. Other questions? John?
Well, and I think to David Moore's point, we're looking at what costs are projected to be with a 7% return and a 7% discount rate. Perhaps we ought to look at something like the last 15 years with regard to returns and get a feel for what could be possible. And at 5.4%, I think it gave us a 75% confidence. And it's just a data point to be aware of, because no matter what we do, projections are never right on. So and hopefully it's better.
Bill, just a follow-up to that. And I know it's beyond our charge, but to be thinking now those different scenarios. So we have an 08 or an 02 event. You know, how does the city think about that? without destroying everything else that defines a city? You know, what's the backup plan?
Because effectively, this is a linear model. Well, let's show over the next 5 years, we have a 3% return. What do the costs go up to? Because we've been through that, twice in the last 15 years. What does that look like from a funding obligation to the city?
Okay. I think that's it. Can you model something like that, David?
I think so. I mean, it may be easier just to stick with the kind of existing two-scenario approach of 7 and 5.4. So if that's been working,
right,
that might be the simplest way to look at, how does this plan, work or under a low return scenario.
Okay, other questions? Cindy?
In the July report from Pew, they listed out the changes. There's a graph listing out the changes that the Police and Fire Pension Fund sought, and what is being offered is everything but the hedge funds for the reasons expressed by Pew, which is the state has hedge fund power, has purchasing power that affects that. It's all of the FRS powers, but except for hedge funds. And I will recirculate it so people don't have to go through it, but there's a very easy to digest chart in the Pew materials in July.
Okay, super. Ted?
I wanted to just discuss the document that I...
Oh, yeah, let's sort of bring this to a close.
Okay.
Excuse me. It's really too early to go over the governance. I think John and I need to sit down and talk some about the governance, meld that together. Ted did present another committee proposal, and so just explain it very briefly.
The reason,
and you all have
I just want to explain the reason I presented it. The last meeting, we had gone over, and it looked like...
Nobody has it?
No. It's a one-page document.
Yeah, we don't have it.
Carol, do you have more copies of that? Looks like, here's a couple other copies.
Here they come.
The reason I did it is because Bill told me to, so, but I was, at the last meeting, I was suggesting that instead of just ordering, because it's a real bone of contention as to whether or not the 30-year agreement exists or whether collective bargaining agreement is required. And my thought was to do this in a little bit more cooperative fashion, create a system through which the unions can participate in either collective bargaining or other negotiations of benefits by creating a board or a committee of elected members to, and the reason is basically what we've seen is in other cities, it's very awkward to collectively bargain if you do have to collectively bargain. So why not create a system by which they can collectively bargain if it's necessary? And that's basically what I put together. So, it's just offered for that suggestion and trying to show that we're being more cooperative rather than just telling them, hey, they need to return to the table and collectively bargain. And you may or may not have issues with it, or it may not be drafted well, but that's just my submission.
So let's put this on, put in our papers, but isn't that ultimately a question for the unions, because it's their right?
Well, it sets it up so that the unions can designate this board to collectively bargain if they wish to do so.
Okay.
So it's an optional thing, but it creates the mechanism, and that's what I was aiming to do. The other thing that I just wanted to point out briefly is I did have conversations with David Drain, because, and it may be academic because it looks like what we're trying to do is address some of the issues on the mayor's plan, which is a continued defined benefit plan. But I did want to look through the academic research on whether there's any guidance as to what happens in the selection of a defined benefit plan versus a defined contribution or a cash balance. There's very, very little literature. The only thing I found was something out of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and it's very interesting. This guy uses modeling processes. He's a professor, and he concludes that there is a substantial cost, especially when you have a high learning curve for employees, there's an effectiveness cost in your employees of approximately up to 17% that would, of additional cost of lost employee effectiveness switching from a defined benefit like we've got to defined contribution plan. And he also cites that in those plans that do move to a defined contribution plan, there's generally other costs to try to limit turnover, such as additional bonuses or severance benefits or other benefits that wind up. So it's always been my thesis, and I don't think there's anything that's really supported it, that changing retirement plans for public sector, especially public safety employees, has other hidden cost. The cost of the turnover, the cost of loss of expertise with the turnover, and the retraining cost. And I think in addition to all those, I think that just the employee effectiveness changes are quite substantial, as pointed out by this professor.
So he'll commend this to you. I want y'all all to, your homework for tonight is to look at page 8 and understand that formula.
It is hard to understand. It's all very difficult. But
okay. All right. Under the statute, we need to have some time for public comment. So if there are no more questions among us.
Just a point of order.
Yes.
I had some just edits I think will be non-controversial to your governance document. I can just, do I send those to you by email? Do I raise them? That's okay. All right.
Yeah, I think that'll be fine.
Okay.
Cindy, is that okay? Where's Cindy left? Can he email me some minor changes to the draft governance?
Yes.
Under the Sunshine Law?
People can email.
It's still public records.
Right, it's public records. People can email you. You can't correspond back to them, so no exchange back and forth, but you could be the repository.
But he could get my exchange when I recirculate it to the whole committee.
You can recirculate a draft. You can't be communicating through the emails.
And staff sends it to you.
That would be a cleaner
Send
way.
it to Cindy. And Cindy will send it to me.
A quick
To everybody
calendar
at the
question. So we're supposed to be finished by February what? Is there?
We
And
got 2 more meetings.
okay.
Right. It's the 29th and the 12th. Okay, Greg?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last meeting, we talked about a piece of legislation that's currently in finances and I think a couple TEU dealing with the investment criteria going forward. You have spoken against that with the passage is wanting to coordinate with this committee's findings. And I was hoping that we were going to get a chance to talk about what the criteria should look like, since we have so many excellent professionals here. And can we make sure that's on the agenda?
Yes, and that's one reason I forgot about.
I got it hung up in committee.
So yeah, that's definitely what we need to do.
Okay, thank you.
One question, if we still want to keep, David, you can probably help. Do we still want to keep our proposals on the defined benefit as modified plus the hybrid and now plus the mayor's proposal? Or do we just, in terms of our?
I think can I give you a long answer, a little bit longer answer? You know, we came to the meetings today with the mayor's proposal having been rejected by council, and with the civic council having suggested that some things that might be worthy to consider a little bit more fully were, can we increase funding and get more of the problem behind us? Can we tighten the benefits for existing employees? And for the new employees, can we end up with a structure that targets trying to get to a 10% normal cost? So the city has today come forward and said, look, towards the spirit of those objectives, we've given thoughtful consideration to a lot of this. We think we would endorse changing the modified settlement proposal for existing employees to have these additional changes in it, which would tighten those benefits up. And so I think if we had a way to comprehend it, I think that is the actionable definition of what a defined benefit plan for existing employees would be. For the committee to have a point of view on it, we need to sort of know, well, so what did we do there? Did we do a little bit? Did we do something significant? How do we have a perspective as to what we've accomplished? But I think we have, with all respect, Chris, unless you think otherwise, sort of this is what we think we can do to get get you in the direction of what you've asked for, and I don't, that's what we're prepared to endorse, at least for purposes of discussion. And so I think that becomes
where we go.
Where we go. The only difficulty is everybody's been doing their work on the MSP, so what can Pew and what can Robert DeZuby do to incorporate, the new version versus the MSP is the only fly in the ointment. And
that's what I think. So but as a committee, that's the direction we want to go, so we can sort of lay aside for the moment, pending those, testing the hybrid.
Well, on the hybrid, so that's on the defined benefit. What is the defined benefit? And so that's the direction for the defined benefit. I think the question of the hybrid, we had a lot of good work by Pew, which they tried to take on for us, the question of how would costs change under different alternatives. Right. And the real thing, and what they gave us was good work, but it was difficult to understand from several standpoints. It threw all the money together, the existing unfunded liability as well as new benefits. And really, what's actionable is new benefits, right? And so some of the charts that I've asked David about that I think he's working on would try to show if we make 7%, the hybrid plan and the defined benefit plan all look the same. What really starts to come out as a difference is, well, what happens if you do better or you do worse? And particularly for the city, if you do worse. So the slides that David is working on would try to show for the hybrid plan and for the defined benefit plan, what happens if we're at 7%, what happens if we're at 5.4%. And what we will see, I think, David, correct me if I'm wrong, is we'll be able to see that we're under the hybrid plan, the city has avoided what would have been a situation that we couldn't have afforded. But then a value judgment will be required by the task force as to which of these benefit structures can we think we afford and what's competitive in terms of attracting talent. And I think your slides will help us inform that question, don't you, David?
So we'll keep the hybrid for now.
I think it's a valid question and needs to be accepted or rejected.
New proposal.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
That's what I wanted to get to.
Yeah, it's a long answer, I thought.
No, that's great. Anything else? Public comment, any public comment? We're going to have 2 minutes. Please state your name and address, and Kelly, will you time this? Thank you.
Okay. Curtis Lee, 7537T Ticket Court, Jacksonville. All right. First, I'm disappointed it's only 2 minutes, but quickly. For the JEA idea, I'm very skeptical. $40 million on $1.9 million in revenue is a 2% increase in JEA rates. However you look at it, that's a tax. In terms of the benefit change ideas we've been talking about, I would say it would be much more palatable to taxpayers if the 99,000 cap was reduced, if the 75% salary replacement ratio was reduced. That's really not common in private industry. People don't get that kind of replacement ratio. And further, if everyone had to wait until 62 to collect, as they do with Social Security. Remember that nobody in Social Security as a retiree is getting over $30,000 a year, and they retire at age 70, and they're the high-income, high-wage earner people. So comparatively, even these reduced benefits are still too high. Litigation reform is needed. Mr. Klausner has personally profited through his firm at least $700,000 in the last 4 years in losing cases. One of his losing cases was where I sued the Police and Fire Pension Fund under the Public Records Act. He personally wrote one of the letters which was held to be a violation of the law. I find it very distasteful that he continues to, in my view, rip off the pension plan. As for other things, given the Police and Fire Pension Fund history of violations of the law, public record, sunshine, labor, financial disclosure, and sunshine, pension law as well, 5 different laws they violated in the last 4 years. I think one of the things on the table should be that the city should control the Police and Fire Pension Fund Board of Trustees, or better yet, eliminate the Board of Trustees and have the Jacksonville retirement system administer the fund and administer the plan that relates to the fund. The separation of the police and fire pension fund from the city and its independence has been a financial loser for the city. It's been an ethical failure. It's been a legal failure.
15 seconds.
Okay, all right. I make these comments on behalf of myself and concerned taxpayers of Duval County. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? Seeing no other people, next steps, you've heard what the next steps are, and our next meeting will be, I think it's at 9 o'clock on the 29th. Is that right, Carol? 9 o'clock? Okay. Thank you all again for your tireless work, and it's, the city will appreciate it.
You really, you understand the whole legal city.